I'm so pleased to welcome you to the, the 18th Annual Child Welfare Conference, sponsored by the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare at the School of Social Work at the University of Minnesota. My name is Dr. Tracy Laliberty, and I'm the Executive Director for the Center. The work of our center is focused squarely on supporting, educating, enhancing, and celebrating the child welfare workforce, and thus dedicated to increasing the knowledge base of its professionals. One way we do this is to continue to examine issues that challenge the child welfare workforce as you strive to provide competent and effective services. And today, as we engage with one another about the impact of housing and homelessness on child welfare, we're going to ask you to think critically and to dig in to think about changes and a different way to do your work. Today's conference is made possible by the federal Title IV funds that come to us from the Minnesota Department of Human Services and by support from the College of Education and Human Development and the School of Social Work. 2017 marks both the 25th anniversary of the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare and the 100th anniversary of the School of Social Work at the University of Minnesota. We are the oldest public school of social work in the country, and child welfare has been at the center of the work that we've done in the school since its inception. The strong relationship that is involved between us over the past 25 years has strengthened both of the partnerships in immeasurable ways. Our collaboration has positioned us to serve local, state, national, and international child welfare stakeholders to improve outcomes for children and families. In honor of our anniversary, we've created Practice Gems, which are a collection of inspirational thoughts and insights into child welfare practice. Everyone who's on site at the conference today has received this gift from us for our anniversary, and if people who are watching through the video stream would like a copy, they can contact the center and we'd be happy to mail that out to you. I've gone through the Practice Gems several times, and it's a great way to reflect on our work. In a moment, I'm going to have the pleasure of introducing you to Dr. Jim Reinerty, who's the director of our School of Social Work, and he will tell you a little bit more about the school's 100th anniversary and celebration. But before that, I want to talk a little bit more about the conference and to let you know that in addition to the conference and the speakers that we have brought for you today, we have published another issue, a new issue of CW 360 on the impact of housing and homelessness on child well-being. CW 360 has over 24 articles reviewing research, practice, and policy related to understanding and implementing interventions related to housing and homelessness among children, youth, and families involved in child welfare services. This publication, well known to many of you and utilized across the country, was designed to be broad in its scope, addressing both the challenges faced by unaccompanied youth as well as families receiving services. Because of the scope of these articles, this issue, if you open up your issue of CW 360, and folks at remote sites should also have a copy of this. If you're viewing through WebStream by yourself, you can also access the publication through the CASCW website, our center's website. If you open up the publication, you'll see in the margins on the side 2 small icons. A single icon represents if that article pertains specifically to youth, unaccompanied youth. The 2 icons together, the 2 little people together, signify that that article pertains specifically to families, and some articles have both and certainly apply across both unaccompanied youth and families. It was a way for us to be able to include a broader scope of the research and practice information into one publication for you. As conference attendees, you each receive a copy, and electronic copies are also available on the website. And if you'd like additional hard copies to hand out at unit meetings or collaboration meetings with other stakeholders, you're welcome to request those from the center, and we'll get those mailed to you. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that in conjunction with this conference, the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare awards its annual Child Welfare Leadership Award for outstanding contributions to child welfare practice in the state of Minnesota. And I know that we have national folks tuned in today, so bear with me a little bit while we boast about what's happening in Minnesota. The 2017 award recipient has truly dedicated her career, in fact, her entire life, to improving outcomes for children and families involved in child welfare and to the professionals who serve the field. The 2017 recipient is Professor Esther Wattenberg. Professor Wattenberg has served on the faculty at the University of Minnesota since 1951, and 25 years ago had the vision and understanding of the tremendous impact that the Title IV education and training program would have on our field when she started the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare. Esther still comes to work 3 days a week and partners not only the child welfare field, but the policy realm as well, with a co-appointment over at CURA in the Humphrey School of Public Policy. Esther's work cannot possibly be summarized in this brief introduction. However, we will honor her vast contributions and her 60 years of service to the state of Minnesota in a luncheon later today. Suffice to say that the impact of her work can be seen and felt by families and practitioners at local, state, and national levels. Please join me in congratulating Professor Esther Wattenberg as the 2017 recipient of the Child Welfare Leadership Award. It's really fun, too, when you get to honor one of your own. Today, we will also recognize the work of 3 current child welfare professionals by awarding them the Minnesota Child Welfare Exemplary Service Award. 2017 awardees are Julia Weiss of Morrison County, Sarah Kutro and Helen Martin, both of Hennepin County. It's not enough that we acknowledge the amazing work of frontline workers and It isn't often enough that we acknowledge the amazing work of frontline workers and supervisors in this field. We do the heavy lifting. You take the brunt of the criticism from the media, from the families, from coworkers and administrators, and we appreciate the work that our workers and our supervisors do. We have received very strong nominations for the award this year and are proud to recognize the excellent work, the years of service, and the tireless effort of these 3 individuals. Please join me in congratulating Sarah, Helen, and Julia. The topic for today's conference, the impact of housing and homelessness on child well-being, has been one that we have wanted to engage in for a number of years. A considerable amount of work has been done across the country to understand the role that insecure housing and homelessness plays in child maltreatment. In fact, nearly 5 years ago, the Children's Bureau created the largest demonstration grants in their history in order to understand how the presence of safe and stable housing could serve as a protective factor for children and families involved in 5 child protection systems across the country. Because those demonstration grants usually run 5 years, we're just going to start to get the outcomes, but there are some preliminary findings that you will find written about in your CW 360. It was an extraordinary amount of money and a recognition that people need some basic, stable, and secure housing before they can address any of the other issues related to child maltreatment. We're excited to hear what those findings bring. As practitioners and systems struggle to address the serious issues of housing, practice with youth and families goes on. We decided that it was critical to engage across systems and within our child welfare workforce to talk about ways in which our practice can and has to change in order to be responsive to some of the most vulnerable families that we serve. To do this, we need to bring in some new practices. We need to understand practices that have been developed and utilized successfully in other jurisdictions. And we also need to leverage policy to address the needs of the children and families whom we serve. That is what we are here to do today and what your CW 360 will do for you after you leave the conference and engage in those conversations at a more local level. You may be interested to know today that there are 562 people registered for the conference. It's one of our largest conferences of all time, and it's because of the topic. It's because of the interdisciplinary challenges we face in trying to effectively serve families. We have 41 off-site web streaming groups where people are watching in groups and units in their offices. There are 149 people individually in front of their computer screens web streaming from 12 different states. Finally, we're hosting 238 people on site. We're especially pleased to be able to host participants from a multitude of disciplines to engage in the conference today. An archived link of this video conference will be available later in the month on the center's website. Very quickly, I know as people registered on site, and this really does apply just to the folks on site, people were talking about whether or not you also provided services in your child welfare work to individuals with disabilities, parents who had disabilities, and were working on another project at the same time and doing some interviews. So if people are interested and willing to share your experiences, we'll be doing those video recordings, and you can just see the registration desk for how you can participate. We certainly would appreciate that. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you the director of the School of Social Work at the University of Minnesota, Dr. Jim Reinerty.
Good morning and welcome, everyone. On behalf of the School of Social Work, I certainly welcome you to this conference on housing, homelessness, and child well-being. And on behalf of the school, particularly in this 100th anniversary. Actually, when I think of the 100th anniversary, I often think about the original title of our school. When we began in 1917, we were called this Training School of Civic and Social Work. And it seems to me, particularly in a time like this, maybe we should change the name back, because in the progressive era, it kind of reflects the very deep understanding of the deep social and structural issues that social work and child welfare face. And actually, when I talk a little bit about Esther this afternoon, I'm going to bring that up, that in some way she and her work really represents that close relationship between the need for understanding poverty, the need for understanding social circumstance with how we shape our work. And I would say that this has been pretty much the theme of the school throughout its 100 years. And it's reflected also in the center and its 25th anniversary, and it's reflected in the theme of this conference. And I'll just say a few things about that. As Ruth White points out in a very informative article in the 360, which is the center's publication, and as I'm sure she'll mention it today, that it was only in the recession and unexpected spike in family homelessness in the mid-'80s that society began to take notice of homelessness. But there was homelessness back in the 1970s when our school began. It had a different shape, the shape of tent cities and the shape of migrants walking around the country. And there was homelessness actually before our country began. You go back to the 1640s. And at that time, back then, homelessness was all about moral deficiency and character flaws. If a family without home came to a community, they had better be able to prove their worth. When you mix child welfare and homelessness, maybe some of that attitude still remains today and is amplified, Or maybe the attitude can be one of a social learned helplessness, that homelessness is unavoidable. But those of you who work in child welfare with families know how important it is for us to know more and to understand the relationship between housing insecurity and child welfare. And we all always need to know more. Today is an opportunity to do so, to further understand the impact of unstable housing on families and youth, and to share strategies and experiences that will make for a better practice. Again, welcome to all of you.
Thank you, Jim. Hello, everybody. My name is Karina Berry, and I'm the Director of Outreach for the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare. And I'm going to give some quick updates on logistics for the conference today. And so I wanted to briefly review the conference materials that you'll find in your folders on your table. You should have a copy of the CW 360, the agenda, a social media handout, copies of the PowerPoint presentation for the keynote, as well as additional handouts from our speakers. We want to ensure this conference is an interactive experience for everyone participating on site as well as via web stream. We encourage you to use your phones, your laptops, and tablets to engage with us throughout the conference on social media, Facebook, Twitter. You can send questions through email. If you refer to the handout in your folder titled Join Our Online Discussion, we provide a little bit more information on how to find our various social media pages, how you can email in your questions. And as you're composing tweets and messages, if you could use the hashtag CW Housing, which is also here on the podium. If anyone forgets, it's on that Join Our handout or Join Our Online Discussion handout in your folder as well. Also, we will have a couple breaks throughout the day. We're using every minute possible, and the web stream will end after our final wrap-up, close to 12:30. At that time, those of you viewing from afar via web stream, the web stream will end, and anyone who is a site coordinator, anyone who is watching from a remote group site can see your site coordinator for further instructions. We will also offer CEUs for today's conference. They will be available at the end of the conference for folks on site. We will have evaluations, which we will hand out at the end. And upon completing your evaluation, we can give you a CEU. You'll see CASCW staff, and we can mention that again later on in the conference. And for our web streamers, individual web streamers, you can find the evaluation and access the CEUs on the individual web streamer web page. And for our off-group sites, your site coordinators have evaluations and CEUs for you. For on-site folks, if you have not seen yet, the restrooms are to our right, just past the fireplace and the bar area over here. Please be courteous to our speakers and take a moment now to turn off your phones, put them on silent. So at this time, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Ruth White. Ruth is one of the nation's leading experts on housing policy and child welfare. Ruth is the Executive Director of the National Center for Housing and Child Welfare. Please welcome Ruth White.
What, can I put it all the way down? You could do this. Great, okay. I'm short, so I can't see over that.
Sorry, not all the way down.
Yeah. So right when the IT guy walks away, Karina breaks everything. So can we just get him back? That was really record speed. You messed that up in record speed. Nice job. Well done. Oh, he's back. She was trying to help me because I'm short. There goes the live stream, right?
Oh, the laptop turned on. Here.
Oh, you know what? You don't have to close it.
Sorry, this isn't my laptop. I don't know what it's. It just won't
Well, the
save.
laptop's back on.
Your system takes a little bit longer to,
I think it was
yeah, there it is.
Okay.
Thank you. What do you think it's like to know how to work one of those things? Wouldn't that be great? Just drop it down. That's fine. No, that's fine. Oh, okay. Hey, so this is a beautiful space. Thanks for having me. I'm a little disappointed because I was told there would be ice cream at the DQ Club. I don't know which one of you guys told me that, but will that be later? We'll be doing that later. It is a beautiful space. It is true, though, that somebody from the center last night told me that you're a little out of control with the M's, okay? So go in the ladies' room. Every door has an M on it. It's maybe too much. I'm a Buckeye fan, okay? So I want to assure you we do the same thing in Ohio State. There's Blockos everywhere. And if my memory serves me correctly, I think it's on the toilet paper, too, okay? So they're everywhere, so don't feel bad. I live in Maryland now. I work in D.C., I'm originally from Cleveland, so I'm sorry. My baseball team came in last night and blew out the Twinkies. My apologies. So it's really an honor to be invited to Minnesota because essentially you have a lot of celebrities here. Well, the center, for example, Ann Maston, like folks who have really moved the ball for child development, for homelessness. Minnesota has had housing child welfare partnerships in place for over 20 years in Hennepin County and Ramsey County. So I'm also very familiar with the work going on in St. Cloud. So it really humbles me to be here. I also want to mention that the speaker on the next panel, Ryan Berg, wrote a book. I would recommend that everyone read it. It essentially offers you a front row seat to what it's like to be a staff person or a young person living in a group home. So it's an honor to be speaking at any kind of presentation with you. Kathy Tenbrook is considered a leader nationally on homelessness in the U.S. And so I also want to point out that I shamelessly use all the Wilder Research Center material in my work. So it's also wonderful to have an opportunity to be here to talk to them. So the National Center for Housing and Child Welfare is about 9 or so years old, but our work really grew out of the Child Welfare League of America. So for many, many years, the Child Welfare League has had a housing department. If you read the article that I wrote in Child Welfare 360, it offers that the Child Welfare League of America is actually the organization that came up with a solution in the late 80s, early 90s, to bring housing and child welfare together and to create like this essentially a perfect marriage of housing and social services. So prepare to be underwhelmed by my remarks because it is the case that much of what I'm drawing on has been going on for the better part of 20 years. But as the dean pointed out, maybe we should put civic back into our title and sort of return to our roots of using community resources to draw on them and to really bring in community partners that are sort of non-traditional partners, housing departments, jobs departments, and things like that, and giving our frontline workers what they need to get the job done. So our mission is twofold. We seek to ensure that no child ever enters foster care or lingers there needlessly as a result of their parents' inability to afford safe, decent housing. But we also seek to ensure that every young person who ages out of foster care has access to safe, decent, affordable housing, and not a plan, but access. And access is often going to mean community partners are going to have to play a role to fill the gap between what they're qualified to earn in the workplace and what the cost of housing is. So what I'll try to do very briefly, we're going to take Q&A, I think, at 10:15. Is that right? 10:15 is fine with me. I'll keep you guys on time. You're welcome. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the landscape of affordable housing. We will discuss some research, although I really want to emphasize that the current research is in the issue that you have of Child Welfare 360, so I'll do very much a cursory overview of that. And then we'll take a look at what the implications are for child welfare agencies, and what should our role as child welfare professionals really even be in this space. And then I would offer to you that partnerships is the most expedient way to help these families and youth. And then, as I said, we'll take Q&A. Okay, so homelessness in America. I know Eric Grumble is here from the State Interagency Council on Homelessness, and there's a lot of really great things going on in the state. But the reality is that family homelessness, apparently according to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, has declined somewhat, maybe 6% or so. But that report, the annual report on homelessness that HUD produces, offers that about 200,000 people and families are homeless every night. And there's a bit of a divergence when you look at the Department of Education numbers. The numbers are quite high. That's probably the case in each county that you look at, that the county public schools are reporting significant increases. Part of that is because they're more on the lookout for families that they can help. And so you have a bit of an issue where they're counting more families. They're more aware of it than they were in the past. But it is a reality that family homelessness is growing. And then, of course, we have more awareness about unaccompanied youth. And these are the figures that HUD offers. But about 11% of this figure are young people who are unaccompanied and under the age of 18. So for me, if in your state, in your community, look to the researchers that are capturing this, not in the aggregate, but how much homelessness you see in your particular city or county, and that's to me more helpful than you knowing what it is on the aggregate across the United States. So again, I know that Wilder does, prior to anything HUD was doing, Wilder Research was capturing numbers and reporting those out. So if you're curious about the patch of land that you live in Minnesota, I would offer that you should check that out. Okay, so this is actually the title. Everyone's living in their parents' basement. So when we talk about youth aging out of foster care or homeless youth, this is the title of an article that was in the National Review a few years ago. And would you believe that that very week that this article ran, the Washington Post does a series where they follow a young professional who's looking for housing in D.C. And that very Sunday, they profiled a young man who had been hired by NIH and was making a pretty good salary. And they followed him as he went around D.C. trying to find somewhere to live. And would you believe that he ended up living in his aunt's basement? Okay, so even a kid who came to D.C. getting a pretty highly paid job found it very difficult to find housing that they could afford. And the latest research on young people in the U.S. more generally shows that the most common living arrangement now, I'm sure you all are aware of this, for 18 to 34-year-olds for the first time in U.S. history is living with their parents. That's the most common living arrangement. So thinking about how we're preparing young people aging out of foster care, we need to keep in mind the macroeconomics here, that most millennials are struggling to afford housing on their own. So how are we going to bring partners in to help close this gap? So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the Midwest evaluation of the adult functioning of former foster youth. Mark Courtney was the primary author on that. Now it's Amy Dworsky, essentially, showing that many young people are working when they leave foster care, but the average annual earnings of these young people is about $8,000. So we really do have to begin to think about different means by which we can close that gap for them. And again, as we move along in my presentation, I'll give you some ideas. Okay, so if you read Nan Roman's article in the Child Welfare 360 issue, it essentially says that housing is the main reason that people are homeless, but she also acknowledges that there's a multitude of it. You can talk to any person who's struggling with homelessness now, and you can find any number of different stories. Divorce, family conflict. I moved, I thought it was gonna hit it big in the big city, and it didn't pan out, and on goes the list. But the reality is that we are hemorrhaging affordable housing in the US at this point, right? So right now, we have a situation where even people who are working, okay, are struggling to pay their rent. Now, the generally accepted rule of thumb in the housing industry is that you should never pay more than 30% of your income for your housing costs, and that actually includes utilities. But what we find now is that 11.4 million households paid over half of their income towards their housing costs, and that is what HUD would consider worst case housing needs. That's an extraordinary number. But at the same time, we're not closing the gap on the affordable housing side. What does affordable housing look like? So we can say it shouldn't be more than 30% of your income, but the National Low-Income Housing Coalition every year compares fair market rent, and I should note that fair market rent is something that HUD calculates, and they essentially take housing in every city, every patch of land in the United States, and they rank it from least expensive to most expensive housing, and then they take the 40th percentile. So that's fair market rent. So this is not a palatial, opulent apartment. This is a nice, livable place that should be affordable, but yet what they find is when they cross-reference fair market rent with what people are earning, it's not affordable, right? So the name of that actual report that where you can pull down your county, your MSA, and find out what fair market rent is in your community is called Out of Reach. Generally comes out in October, so you can consider the figures that you have in the 2016 edition to be current figures. And they're great lobbying tools because they're eye-opening for a lot of people. So they come up with a few different figures. One figure is the housing wage, and the housing wage nationally. So this is, if you want to work a 40-hour week, this is what you have to earn per hour to afford fair market rent for a 2-bedroom apartment. So the Minnesota figure is $17.76 an hour. DC is $13.21 an hour. Now, what's interesting is I know a lot of this center's work is actually directed at practice. It's directed at frontline workers. Several years ago, Sheila Crowley, who was the president of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, a social worker herself, a PhD professor at VCU, she was the principal on this study. So she came to an event we did at the Child Welfare League of America, and she held up her map, and she said, look, in DC, the housing wage is $16.68 an hour, and I think that a lot of the families that you're working with aren't making $16.68 an hour. And what do you think the social worker said? One of them stood up in the front row and said, I don't make $16.68 an hour, right? So we have to think about our frontline workers. $17.76 an hour is a lot of money. So as I said, in DC, it's $13.21 per hour. They also come up with another figure that I think is equally as compelling. What they do is they take minimum wage in your state, and then they cross-reference that with how many hours per week you would have to work earning minimum wage to afford a fair market rent apartment. You want to know what it is in Minnesota? 79 hours a week, right? Are you ready for DC? 119 hours a week. So apparently in DC, polygamy should be legal because you'd have to have 3 full-time minimum wage workers to afford fair market rent in a place like DC if you're on minimum wage. So I offer these figures because these are really good lobbying tools to help people understand the public sector. Someone is going to have to step in and help fill the gap if we want people to be able to function and be part of civil society and afford an apartment. So again, I offer to you that you can read the Child Welfare 360 piece that will offer to you lots of research on child well-being and youth well-being and affordable housing. It is a very interesting coming together of circumstances for my organization that we have this confluence of research institutions that are now engaged in this intersection of housing and child welfare in this space, producing very helpful roadmaps for where we should go. So we have the Child Welfare 360 volume. We now have the Child Welfare League of America did a 10th anniversary edition of a journal. They have a peer-reviewed journal called Child Welfare. It's on the intersection of housing and child welfare. The articles in there are great. The 2004 version of that actually was a very impactful piece of research and essentially kicked off kind of a reemergence of housing resources for families and youth. And in fact, the American Psychological Association will be publishing a journal, I think, this week on housing and child well-being. In June, my organization is co-sponsoring a briefing on Capitol Hill about the intersection of housing and child well-being. So it isn't that there's exactly a lack of data in this space, but what's really interesting about all of this is that we're gaining a lot of national attention, and we hope with that national attention will come perhaps some child welfare funding flexibility, maybe more housing resources as well. So some of the things that we have found is that there's this cumulative effect on young people who experience homelessness and transiency. So how do we get at this issue of mobility, high mobility, families that are doubled up, because that begins to affect their outcomes in the classroom. There's a new organization just formed called Schoolhouse Connection that is going to take this on specifically, how housing impacts kids in the classroom. That will be their entire portfolio. Because this second bullet point is absolutely a staggering and ultimately predictable figure. And we have to deal with the issues in the classroom through McKinney-Vento. But the reality is families need housing and unaccompanied youth need housing. All right, so I'm going to move on to child welfare specifically and urge you, for those of you that are the academics in the room, to really plow through these journals and kind of get up to speed on the specifics on child development, school dropout rates, and so on and so forth. What I would like to do is talk a little bit about how all of this impacts the child welfare system. So I offer to you some studies that we've essentially kind of pulled together to think through how housing affects families on the child welfare continuum, from identification all the way through to reunification and so on. So kind of the truncated version is, if you compare stably housed or precariously housed families to their stably housed peers, what you find is the homeless or precariously housed families are more likely to be identified for abuse and neglect. Once identified, they're more likely to be reported. Once they're reported, they're more likely to be substantiated. And once substantiated, they're more likely to be separated. But where it gets more interesting and difficult for a frontline worker and the courts and the attorneys, quite frankly, is on the reunification front, where a family's done everything they've been asked to do by the courts, but if they're living in their car, a judge in good conscience can't award those children back to their parents. So we get sort of this reunification effect where if the resources are not allocated towards housing, the children will linger in foster care and they become among the longest stayers in the foster care system. Now, I've had this data for a long time, but HHS recently added a figure to this that I had not seen before, but it's recently cropped up in the Green Book, and it's in Child Maltreatment 2015. But apparently, it's more difficult to say that a family would lose their child to foster care. So social workers are not out trolling the shelters trying to remove children from their families. It's just not happening. And even when a family is removed, it's often much more complicated than housing. So it's a kind of a menu of neglect, right? But housing might be on that menu. But HHS reported last year that 10% of children who are removed because of housing problems. And that amounts to about 27,000 kids per year. And HHS I believe in December 2016, they released an informational memorandum on the intersection of housing and child welfare where they offer that figure and actually quite a bit of suggestions on what to do about it, right? But we do have these figures. Now, this other figure is a little bit dated, but it's all that we have. So when we talk about trying to reunify families and having this effect of them being in the court, having met the court's requirements and not being able to be reunified because of housing, how many families does this affect? And APHSA, Child Welfare League of America, worked together in the 90s and tried to survey communities to find out. So they surveyed 20 or 25 states, and they found that the average amount was about 30%. But again, that figure's dated. The other important thing for you to know is aggregated data isn't going to help you. You need to know what this looks like in your court system, and you need to ask your social workers what they're seeing. But I will tell you that a few years ago, Olivia Golden, who now runs the Center on Law and Social Policy, was hired to be the receiver for the District of Columbia's public child welfare agency, and she was quoted in the Washington Post saying that 50% of the children in the care of the District of Columbia CFSA could immediately return home if their parents had affordable housing. So again, there's a considerable range across the United States, and there's any number of ways to get at that. But if you're in Hennepin County and you find out that it's 20%, that isn't nearly as meaningful as that one worker having what he or she needs to help that particular family. So I think it's really less about numbers, more about flexibility and community partnerships. Okay, so why does child welfare get confronted with this issue? Why would it be the case that a family with housing problems would end up at child welfare? Essentially, child welfare is a catch-all bureaucracy. And that's kind of not fair to our frontline workers, is it? That's not fair to our investigators. But the reality is that when every other public or private system has failed to help a family, that family comes to child welfare, and you don't have the luxury of turning that family away or putting them on a waiting list. So if you're a CPS investigator, I actually had the pleasure this morning of hearing Jamie Davis speak at the Title IV breakfast, and she herself has a pretty extraordinary story, so it was an honor to hear her. But as a frontline investigator, you cannot turn that family away. You can't really assess the problem and help make it go away. You're bringing that family into the fold, and I know that there have been some real strides in Minnesota on alternative response, but the reality is you're put into this position because we don't have enough public and private resources in the civic space. So we need to work on that as well. That's partly why my organization has housing in the name, because we have to do lobbying on more affordable housing resources. But be that as it may, you're a catch-all bureaucracy. Okay, so if you go to the Child Welfare Information Gateway and you look up all the state statutes, they actually have them all right there on the website. If you look at all of those, you're going to find that all but 13 states have the inability of a caretaker to provide shelter in the definition of neglect. And I'll cop to the fact that I didn't check Minnesota. I did not check it. But it's important to point out that many of them have kind of a safety valve written in there. Okay, so let's assume the family doesn't have shelter. If as a worker you assess that that's not the family's fault, then that's not really neglect. Okay, so there's that. In fact, in Washington State, because of something called the Homeless Children's Law, they went even further in their state statute to say, just in case you were thinking about removing this kid because the family's homeless, don't do it, because we don't do that here in Washington State. Now, they say it in legalese, okay, but that's essentially what they're saying. Okay. However, don't families still lose their children because they don't have housing? Doesn't that still happen? If you're a frontline worker, I always ask people, like, what do you do about the parking lot situation? Okay, so you have in your state statute, let's say you're in Washington State, and you get your CPS investigator, and you get called to a parking lot behind I won't pick on Target because I'm in Minnesota, Walmart, and it's 9 degrees below zero, and you're called out there because the child is living in the car, and you don't have any motel vouchers for the day, the shelters are full, you aren't aware of flex funds, what do you do? What are you left with? It doesn't matter what your state statute says. You're the catch-all bureaucracy. You have to intervene and do something. So maybe you do a temporary placement order, something of that nature, but you do have to intervene. So I don't want to say that the state statutes are insignificant, but where the rubber hits the road, we put actual humans, actual social workers in that space and ask them to do their job, and that is an impossible thing to have to do, okay? So we end up dealing with more housing issues than we would have anticipated because we are a catch-all bureaucracy. Okay, so it turns out if we were to arm child welfare workers or someone with housing resources to actually help a family who is struggling with housing stability, homelessness, domestic violence, where they're housed, but in order to keep their children safe, they need to leave, but they can't because they don't have housing. If we were to arm workers with affordable housing resources, it would be cheaper. It would be cheaper. So this is actually from the 2004 journal that I mentioned that the Child Welfare League of America published. Since we're talking about Title IV folks, the principal author on this is Deborah Harberger, who was a Title IV student with University of Maryland, and now all of these Title IV people run off and do amazing things. Like, who's the guy I heard about today that's the commissioner in Colorado? So it's apparently a pretty great program. Deborah Harberger is now with the University of Maryland. Okay, so she went on to bigger and better things than the Child Welfare League, I guess. But she, as an intern, helped co-author this piece with me. And what she essentially did was she looked at the cost of affordable housing, or Section 8, the cost of a Section 8 subsidy for the typical family, and and supportive services, because we didn't just fall off the apple cart, right? Housing is not a silver bullet here. The families need housing, but they often need all the amazing therapeutic resources the case managers offer, the safety planning, and so on and so forth. It turns out that HHS has a figure for that. They say that the average high-needs Medicaid family is about $5,000 of case management services per year. The National Alliance to End Homelessness has a similar, same figure for the similar portfolio of services. Now, you might have a family that needs intensive case management and costs significantly more than that, but you may have a family that needs what the National Alliance to End Homelessness would call a lighter touch, right? So the average is $5,000. So if you look at the cost of a Section 8 voucher subsidy plus $5,000 of supportive services per year, what you find is a savings of about $57,000 per family. So we actually redid these figures, but we used, in anticipation of Title IV funding becoming extremely flexible via the Family First Act. I think we all know how that ended up. We didn't get flexibility, but in anticipation of getting flexibility, we reran this data with 2015 figures and said, what if we just use child welfare money? Like, Section 8 is, the spigot is essentially turned off right now. What if we just use the child welfare dollars to do it? And what we found was a savings, even by today's figures, of $32,000 per family. And I ran the numbers for each state based on your state's fair market rent and your state's cost of one foster child in care for a year. Do you want to know what Minnesota's was? So if you were to reunify all the kids separated because of housing, and we use the 30% number, and pay for supportive services, you would save $8.7 million for your state. Now, again, people may take issue with those, but I've been following the Housing Child Welfare Partnership evolution in Minnesota for many, many years. And about 15 years ago, a Hennepin County executive was quoted as saying, the family unification program, which couples housing and child welfare, saved the county $77 million. So I guess my figures are a little more conservative than that. But again, what would this look like if you used your state dollars, so on and so forth, to keep the families together? Would it be cheaper? Could it be a more prudent investment of public dollars? So we're happy to help you run those numbers. Now, on the youth side of this equation, we didn't run these numbers. This data here comes from Urban Peak, which is a street outreach program in Denver, Colorado. And they found that it's 1/10 of the cost to provide permanent housing with supportive services to young people leaving foster care when you compare what happens to them if you leave them on the street, okay? Of course, we can never calculate the moral toll of aging these kids out onto the street, but we can come up with a dollar figure, and it's about 1/10 of the cost when you look at juvenile justice, adult prison systems, and residential treatment facilities. What's interesting is last summer I was in Fresno, California, and I quoted this figure, and everyone started laughing at me. And I thought, what have I done? And I said, is that figure too high? Why are you laughing at me? And they said, honey, you are way off. It's $125,000 per year for one kid to be in the California Youth Authority, okay? So I offer to you, I don't know what the cost is in Minnesota, but again, there's a moral toll here to aging kids out without supportive services, especially when we know what the macroeconomics look like. Okay. I know it is the case that in many places, social workers, case managers have at their disposal flex funds. And I think that's absolutely necessary. I am not here to tell you not to use flex funds. But the research in this space shows that when we're trying to get families and youth to develop a sense of the future, that offering assistance to them only when there's a crisis or problems invites problems. So essentially, if you can get someone in a situation where they have sustained economic investment, which is why I'm an advocate for Section 8, programs like Section 8, people are more than happy to come to you if you have a case management meeting a month later and say, I'm doing great. I'm doing job training now. My kids are doing great in school. On the other hand, if the only way they can get $300 from you is to come in and say, everything's falling apart, my brakes are broken, then they're more likely to report problems. So the research shows that a sustained economic investment is better therapeutically, but also when looking at the there's families in Illinois that get regular housing assistance that's under the Norman consent decree. They call them the Norman families. When those families were studied, they found that not only did caseloads go down, but it was cheaper for the state, but also they found that the sustained economic investment was more likely to prevent a recurrence of maltreatment than the therapeutic interventions. So I'm not here saying we shouldn't be doing therapeutic interventions. What I'm saying is it has to be coupled with an economic solution, or the families, your therapeutic intervention might not pay off. So this is probably kind of hard to see, but the important part here is that we're here courtesy of Title 4E, really. But Title 4E composes about half of the child welfare spending that states receive, but it's very inflexible. It's very inflexible. And when I was writing my article for Child Welfare 360, I essentially had a what can only be described as an existential crisis, because I realized I don't know that it's a bad thing that Title 4E is inflexible. So I've spent 15 years trying to get it to be flexible, but maybe it is the case that the kind of work we do in child welfare is so important, and foster care placements have to be so good and so much better than the circumstances we remove the kids from, that maybe there should be an iron fence around this money, okay? And I say that to you because the other half of this is fairly flexible. TANF, for example, time limits and all, is pretty flexible. SSBG is flexible. But I'm also not really suggesting that that whole system be blown up and used for housing. But do know that there's flexibility in there. But state child welfare dollars are completely at the discretion of child welfare commissioners, governors, state legislatures, and so on and so forth. So I will offer to you a couple of examples of how some states have gone way farther out on the housing continuum to use that flexibility to the advantage of themselves and families. So, segueing to what you can do about it, some of that flexibility is a part of what I'm going to say. We are not trying to turn child welfare agencies into public housing authorities. That's not what our work is about. Our work is about progress through partnerships, right? So, who did I meet today that set up the Housing 101 website? Oh, hi. Can you just like wave? So go talk to her. Right. So partner with her. Okay, we're not trying to turn you into child welfare or into public housing authorities. The other thing is my existential crisis was sort of related to the fact that there's been some research, some came out over the summer from Mary Beth Shin, about the fact that homeless families are more likely than housed families to be reported to child welfare, but they're no more likely to be substantiated in this particular report. So the question is, why are we subjecting them to a report, right? So in a lot of ways, maybe we should be doing less investigation of homeless families. But be that as it may, when a child welfare worker engages with the family, they have to know how to help prevent homelessness. So if I'm a shelter worker and a family comes to me, they're essentially almost always already homeless. Things have completely spiraled out of control and they're at the doorstep of my shelter, or they're calling the CANS line or something, coordinated access line. I'm at a disadvantage. I can't prevent homelessness. It already happened. Or maybe it's so far exacerbated that I can't do anything to fix it. But child welfare workers meet families at all different points on the housing continuum. So what could we do to help prevent a family from becoming homeless? And that's something I think we should capitalize on, because if we're trying to end homelessness in the United States among families and youth by 2020, we have to have more boots on the ground, okay? So yes, I do believe that child welfare workers should be trained on homeless prevention and have the latitude to use some of their own resources to do it. There's any number of conversations going on now, again, partly courtesy of the Interagency Council on Homelessness here in Minnesota. And people are tuned in now. Even public housing authorities now are tuned into the fact that they should be coupling their resources with service providers. So get a seat at the table. I know we don't want to open the floodgates, but offer some transparency into what the child welfare portfolio of services looks like. And then I do want to show you a slide about youth aging out. There is a way to use child welfare resources very flexibly for youth in foster care to prepare them for economic self-sufficiency, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So Kathy Tenbrook has an article in Child Welfare 360, but again, on a national level, we've all been aware of her work for many, many years. And she offers some pretty helpful suggestions about this space between housing and child welfare. Part of it is increasing options, and again, that's beyond the borders of child welfare. What are we doing to expect that the mayors, the housing authorities, private investors, so on and so forth, are providing affordable housing in a non-discriminatory way to families who are struggling and need help? What are we doing on homeless prevention? The Homeless Emergency and Rapid Transition to Housing Act that passed in like 2008 was supposed to make it so that McKinney-Vento, now called Hearth Act, resources could be used for prevention. And there's still not enough being done to help families be prevented from ending homelessness. And I would take that bill out and reread it and start trying to get HUD to understand that your mandate is homeless prevention. Much better to keep the families in their home of origin and minimize transitions in housing. And then again, you're going to hear from the host homes folks today, mentoring for youth aging out of foster care, connecting them to adults in their life that are healthy relationships. Now, the research, Mark Courtney and Amy Jaworski's research shows that about 40% of the kids who age out of foster care go immediately home to the families we remove them from, okay? So as Mark Courtney likes to say, they have families, they have parents. So for the kids where that's a good decision, you know, the research sort of says work on that relationship, the repair of that relationship early on and acknowledge that that's where they're going. But for where those are not good relationships, host homes and other kinds of mentorship opportunities to help give them options so they don't have to go back to that, that lifestyle if it's not appropriate is pretty important. Okay, so Kathy gives us our marching orders on youth aging out of foster care. So this is a chart that I did maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And we created this so that we can begin to build some predictability and forecasting into the child welfare system. And now, it is not that a child welfare worker doesn't understand that a kid's going to be 26 one day, okay? They get it. And I know there are training packages to help social workers learn how to talk to teenagers, okay? I understand that. But I think part of why they don't talk a lot about economic self-sufficiency and housing, and Mark Courtney actually had an article in 2004 that showed this. Child welfare workers know housing and economic security is a problem. But if they don't have resources, they feel it's not helpful to engage with a family or youth on that, right? Let's talk about something positive, because you're basically going to be homeless when you're 18, okay? So I don't know that this is necessarily a training issue. I think that's important. But I offer it because as administrators, we can look at these resources on a continuum and make sure that we're doing our work as policy people to eliminate any kind of gap here. Okay, so I think I have a laser pointer. Let's see if it works. All right. So little bit of a controversial note. Our organization believes that if you are an unaccompanied youth under the age of 18, you should be getting Title IV money should be following you the way Medicaid follows you. So if you need to go to a really nice housing facility for LGBTQ youth, that's better for you than being in a foster home. Again, for you. We're not ascribing or prescribing all of this for everyone. But HHS says developmentally appropriate placement for that kid, okay? If that's right, then the Title IV money should follow them to that placement. There shouldn't be any homeless kid for any significant period of time in the United States under the age of 18, okay? In states where you can stay in foster care till 21, we also believe that unaccompanied youth should be served under Title IV. I hope that's not too controversial for this audience, but it is what it is. All right, so moving on. At about age 18, if it's appropriate, a young person can get their own apartment and Title IV can pay for it. So actually in Ohio, they do this for kids under the age of 18. They get them their own apartment, and they provide a life coach every day if that's necessary. And believe it or not, that's cheaper than a group home, okay? So anyway, we offer that Title IV-E can be used. HHS's guidance on this is excellent, very flexibly for kids aged 18 to 21 to prepare them. The other thing that we've been trying to engage people in discussions about is right here, you could subsidize rent, but you could also put a sizable portion of that money away into a savings account. So the model that we like is HUD's Family Self-Sufficiency Program. I'll just tell you what that is very quickly. HUD identified in the 90s that if you are in public housing or Section 8 and you get a job, your rent goes up. So there's sort of a disincentive to improve your course. So they created the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. It's a voluntary 5-year program. You don't have a case manager, you have a coordinator, because the case management services are out in the community. Go to these people, they know how to write resumes. Go to this job training over here, we'll pay for it. They don't do the services in-house, they coordinate. And your goal plan is something that you yourself write. Okay, it's a 5-year program. So what happens in this program is, if your income goes up, you do pay more in rent. But that increase you pay goes into an escrow account. We would call that a savings account. But at the end of 5 years, you are handed that money free and clear. So there are people that have graduated from the Family Self-Sufficiency Program at HUD with $60,000 in the bank, because often banks step in and match that dollar for dollar, okay? They use it to buy a car, they use it to buy a house. I have wonderful stories about clients I myself have worked with who've done the most magical things with the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. But we're offering that you could do a similar thing with Title IV-E dollars, or maybe federal dollars, where it's more predictable. So there are agencies that do savings accounts, but they're not tied to kind of the real world experience. Also, there are child welfare agencies where we try to wean kids off of services, and the way we wean kids off of services is, if Johnny gets 10 more hours at Taco Bell, then we cut his $800 a month stipend down to $600 a month. So what Johnny learns is, if I improve, I get penalized. Right? So what we've said is, you can still reduce the subsidy, but put it into a savings account for him. So we'll run it like the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. It turns out a few years ago, along with the Corporation for Supportive Housing, we pitched an idea to allow youth who are in the Family Unification Program, which is a Section 8 program for youth and families, for the youth to enroll in the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. And Congress, we suggested it to the Appropriations Committee, and within 2 weeks it was in the bill and it passed. And so HUD is currently doing a program with 50 housing authorities, allowing youth to participate in that program. So we'd like to translate that into child welfare proper. There is a great law review article that I quote in my piece in Child Welfare 360, written by a young woman named Ferris Champagne. How great is that name? That's a real name. Okay, Ferris Champagne. So she aged out of foster care and just recently graduated from American University School of Law. So what I'm quoting is her law review article, and her law review article says, we do a terrible job of preparing youth aging out for economic self-sufficiency. And so I have the reference for that article, and I would argue that we should all read it. But this is one way to do that. But in any event, I do want to talk a little bit about specifically what the Family Unification Program is before I close. But the reality is, we have to do prediction and forecasting, because there are going to be young people who are going to be able to make it, and they'll have a roommate, they'll be able to afford their rent. That's great. Let's support that kid. But what if, some of these kids are in foster care for 7 years and they age out at 21. If they need a permanent supportive housing unit provided by a local community housing provider, or a public housing authority, we could give them 7 years notice that Johnny is coming, right? Instead of a month before he ages out, or even 6 months. What are we going to do? This kid is never going to be able to live independently, but he could have his own apartment with supports. We could have told them 7 years in advance and had that unit ready to go. So let's build some predictability into our systems. Okay, so the Family Unification Program, I write about this in my article, so I'll be very brief. Couples Section 8 subsidies with supportive services. You cannot even apply to HUD for Section 8 vouchers under this program unless you have a signed memorandum of understanding with your local public child welfare agency. Okay, so the Family Unification Program is not the end-all and be-all of supportive services programs and housing partnerships, but I offer you this slide. There's probably a better copy of this on our website because it's a nice blueprint for any housing provider that you swap into this little yellow bubble right here, the Public Housing Authority. That might be a community housing partner. It might be permanent supportive housing. HUD has really bought into this model. In fact, I'd like to mention that the raise your hand if you've heard of the Veterans Affairs Supportive Housing Program, which is essentially the reason why we've made these inroads into ending veterans' chronic homelessness among veterans. That program is modeled after the Family Unification Program. It used to be transitional housing only, so myself and a few other people went to the Veterans Affairs and said, just run it like the Family Unification Program and have housing authorities do the housing so it can be permanent. So it's modeled after this program. This is a very successful program. So it is often the case that your child welfare workers, your investigators, your case planners, so on and so forth, aren't going to necessarily have the expertise or the time to find landlords, to get a rental resume together, landlord recruitment, and all those kinds of technical housing issues. So this purple bubble, contract that out. Contract that out to an agency that knows housing, that has a track record with housing, not somebody who flipped the shingle on the front of their nonprofit to say, oh, we do housing. Make sure they have a track record because this can make or break any housing program. If you get Section 8 vouchers and that family cannot find a landlord, they cannot keep that voucher past 120 days, right? So you have to have a willing portfolio of landlords in nice neighborhoods, I would add, working with those families. So there are some resources. I list some of them here. This is not an exhaustive list, but the reality is you have to leave no stone unturned. Go to the Housing 101 website. I think that would be helpful. But this might actually require you to go out to a congregation and say, do you have one property owner, one landlord in this congregation that is willing to help these kids or these families, right? It might require you to go beyond this, but here's another, I think, point that I need to emphasize. In DC, I do double duty. So I go to all the child welfare advocacy meetings, and I go to all the housing advocacy meetings. I'm the only child welfare person who's doing the housing meetings. We have to support these people that are trying to keep housing authorities alive, that are trying to reopen the door to Section 8 vouchers. The other thing I mentioned in my article is I started my career in the mid-90s. We had Section 8 vouchers. We had service, like we had actual resources we could use to help families. So all of the work that we do to train people at this center or University of Maryland or elsewhere is a little bit of a raw deal because they don't have the same resources around them that we had when we were in the 90s. And I did my fair share of complaining in the 90s, trust me, okay? But the reality is we have to be in Congress lobbying or educating Congress, if you're not allowed to say lobbying, about affordable housing and the fact that it is appalling that we have lost 150,000 Section 8 vouchers simply through attrition. So what are we doing on that? And we owe it to our frontline workers to be advocating for all of these different sources at the State House. And so again, as the dean said, restore civic into the name of your school and the name of every other social work school in the country because we do a lot of advocacy but are we advocating on this specifically? And I would like to say that as much as we all love TANF, a $13 increase per week over, did you say a decade, is not this. This is very different than TANF. We have to start lobbying on this. Okay, so it turns out, I know that you must be underwhelmed by my presentation because you already have partnerships like this in Minnesota. And there are places all over the country where they've taken this even a step further. So Connecticut, for example, uses state child welfare dollars to pay housing subsidies for families all over the state, just the way Section 8 would. And they're doing that for something like 800 families. And the reason they do it is because they did their own cost-benefit analysis. The University of Connecticut did it, and they found that they save anywhere between $14 to $21 million per year subsidizing rent for families using state child welfare dollars. And that cost-benefit analysis is key with the state legislature in keeping the money flowing. So what we like to do is connect people to all of those smart people all over the country who are more than happy to help because they don't want the fate of the families in other states to be tied to the fact that they don't live in Connecticut or they don't live in Illinois, right? Or they don't, if you have a certain county that's getting it right, they don't live in that county, they can't avail themselves of those services. So we're happy to help connect you to people that have been doing this for many, many years. I should also offer that back to Connecticut for a second. If you look at the article by Lisa DeMatteis-Lepore, I co-authored that article with her. It's is basically based on the Connecticut model for supportive housing for families, which is 19 years old. But you're going to notice something very interesting in there. And it is that they don't have a 100% success rate of keeping families together and safe. It's about 88%. Now, on the housing side, it's much closer. It's about 90, okay, over a course of a year. Well, the reason it's not 100% is because some of the families have their parental rights terminated, and they're terminated more quickly. Well, why is that? It's because if you're an investigator or a frontline child welfare worker trying to make decisions about where kids are most safely raised, and you're dealing with a family that's in complete chaos, right? Poverty, crazy schedule, living in a homeless shelter, living in a car, so on and so forth. It's difficult to get a clean picture of what their parenting really looks like. So you sort of lose sleep at night, like, God, should I have terminated their parental rights? What should I do in court tomorrow? Because there's so much chaos, right? What they find in Connecticut is, for a portion of the families that they provide Section 8 vouchers to, the parents are terrible parents. They even have parents that say, I'm not good at this. Like, now that I realize all the chaos is and it's kind of a calm, I'm not good at this. I should not be this kid. I shouldn't be the primary caregiver for this kid. So for some situations, they've been able to, the kid gets adopted, but it's an open adoption, and sort of everybody's like, now that this has been a clean transaction, it's still heartbreaking, but it's a cleaner transaction. Okay, so you're not going to see 100% preservation rate or reunification rate. There is no silver bullet. There's no elegant simplicity to any of this. It's very chaotic. But tamping down some of that chaos and getting a clean evaluation of someone is, I think, also going to help the mental health of our workers. Here I put that you can use homeless services dollars for youth and for families. But let me just kind of dwell on youth before I wrap up. No. Okay? Youth are eligible for homeless resources. In fact, the way HUD's written as guidance, it sort of gives the implication that youth coming out of foster care are not eligible for this, that, and the other thing. And then when you ask HUD about that, they're like, we didn't mean that. What? But it's true that a lot of providers think youth aren't eligible. They're totally eligible. They can go right from foster care into a men's shelter. But my organization doesn't dwell on that because we shouldn't be doing that. That's not an exit strategy. So what we try to say is, what can we do earlier on? Now, again, I will offer that there are young people who want nothing to do with you and want a bus ticket to the men's shelter. So I will offer that it's, again, there's no simplicity here. But the reality is we don't talk a lot about the McKinney-Vento programs because we should be using child welfare dollars to prepare young people for not to avoid homelessness, but for economic self-sufficiency and housing stability in adulthood. In fact, I'm not going to mention the state, but I recently talked to someone who runs a juvenile justice program in a state that shall remain nameless. They prepay rent for kids leaving the juvenile justice system on their release for 2 years using federal Department of Justice money. And I just find that fascinating that the department I'm not even sure that's legal, okay? But the reality is they're thinking there's no way these kids are going to make it. What can we do to get the federal money drawn down now and prepay the rent? So I just offer that there's a lot of ways to draw down resources. It shouldn't be from HUD's Homeless Services dollars. But I am a proponent of the Homeless Children and Youth Act of 2017. And that would allow more young people who are homeless and families to get access to HUD dollars. So ask me about that later. I don't want to be overly political. So you can always reach out to my organization for help. We don't charge for technical assistance, so we're not up here trying to get rich off of this. We just want to, again, make sure that a family's fate is not tied to a community that got trained versus a community that didn't get trained. So we want to sort of offer this, blanket the U.S. with this information. And again, we're not trying to turn you into public housing authorities. Collaborations are the most expedient way to get this done. So again, we're happy to help, and more importantly, happy to put you in contact with people that do this on a daily basis. So with that, am I handing it over to you, or am I just taking questions? Oh, okay. So without further ado, questions? Oh, okay. And there's floaters with microphone.
I believe we have some questions from folks watching via web stream. Sorry, I guess not. We don't have any yet. Okay, here we go.
All right. How do we help families facing homelessness in the child welfare system when shelters are filling and they are turning away families and the wait list is so long?
Didn't I just say I wasn't going to be political? I'm a proponent of the Homeless Children and Youth Act, introduced by Senators Rob Portman and Dianne Feinstein. It's a bipartisan, bicameral bill. I won't trouble you with the House folks. Yes, I will, Steve Stivers, and shout out to Dave Loebsack from Iowa. But there is a bottleneck effect at shelters. There are waiting lists at shelters. The coordinated access, coordinated entry, I think you call it here. There is a bit of a logistical problem there, again, with the bottleneck effect. So my suggestion would be, if you are a child welfare professional and you encounter these families, work with your administration to get the money freed up to help the families immediately. So here's the deal. One of the things I had on my previous slide was rapid rehousing. Wouldn't it make sense because rapid rehousing is like a year to 18 months worth of rent, wouldn't it make sense if child welfare was doing rapid rehousing and kind of lying in wait for a Section 8 subsidy to come up or something like that? So that was one of my suggestions for the Families First Act, that Title IV dollars should be used same way that rapid rehousing is used and open it up to a wider group. I wouldn't recommend placing the children, but again, that's the ethical dilemma that we've dealt to frontline staff. And it happens. And it's not their fault. Okay, I don't feel bad because I watched the video from last year and you guys didn't have any questions for her either, so it's you, not me. Oh, there's a question.
Do you have any data about housing for people with disabilities? Because one of my biggest challenges was finding ADA housing for kids that had wheelchairs and things like this. And I would have thought that Minnesota would have done a better job, but we don't. And I had kids that got turned down for wheelchairs by Medicaid because the parents could not find accessible housing that was low income. Is there any data out there about states doing a better job or not?
So the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities does provide that data. ARC, you know, the folks that advocate on behalf of adults with disabilities are not shy about going out and beating the pavement and working with permanent supportive housing providers. But the other thing they've done a really good job of is highlighting something called the Olmsted case. So this was essentially folks that sued the federal government over the fact that they were in the most restrictive setting where they have disabilities, they should be in the least restrictive setting. And every housing authority in the country is supposed to be complying with that, as are city governments. And so I would offer to check in on that because it is true that we're not doing enough. I had someone pull me aside at a presentation I did at Brown University, and she said, I'm a disability rights lawyer, and I think that every single one of these families in child welfare whose kid is placed in foster care because of housing has an Olmsted case to make, that their kids are not in the least restrictive setting and that they should be. So I would say I'm happy to talk to you more about that afterwards, but a very quick example of how I fixed that for one family was when I was running a shelter in Columbus, Ohio, we got a call from someone who was working for a mom whose son had been in a horrible car accident and was wheelchair bound. And she lived on the 4th floor of a building that was stairs only. So she was carrying the kid up and down. So we went to the landlord and we said, we know you have apartments on the 1st floor available. You got to move this woman. Like, what are you doing? And he said no. So again, I'm not suggesting everyone do this, but it's very effective. We called 6 on Your Side. And the news came in and filmed this woman taking the 8-year-old out of the wheelchair, climbing up the steps. The next day they were moved. We didn't even have to protest. The next day they were moved. So those are terrible cases, and my heart goes out to you, but I'd be definitely willing to work with you on that.
We have a question from Facebook. Christina asks, where would workers look to receive training to prevent homelessness?
What's the name of your website again? Shout out to the Housing 101 website. Well, all right. Let's see. Shall I? Shouldn't I? Shall I? I'm going to go ahead and do it. I think the schools of social work should have classes for the Title IV workers, not just the Title IV workers, but a social work class. Some schools do it, some don't, on housing and economic security for all the families that you're working with. I mean, the NASW Code of Ethics essentially says we're supposed to be working with marginalized populations. And it is true that that's a wide swath of the American public, but when it comes to economic issues, I think the schools of social work we need to back that up to like Social Work 101. But it is true that we do have my colleague over here who can talk a little bit about that.
If you're interested, is this on? If you're interested, I would encourage you to go to a website. It's called HB 101. It's Housing Benefits 101. It provides a great deal of information for you as child welfare staff or for individuals to look at the various types of housing that might be available, the various resources that might be available to help pay for housing, as well as it contains a secure vault that people can secure their documents if they don't have a place of their own to keep them. There's a companion website that you may be familiar with, Disability Benefits 101, that's more targeted for people with various disabilities. I would encourage you to go to both of those sites. I would also mention another resource. If you have clients, whether they're adults or children, who are on Social Security benefits, they can apply for something called Minnesota Supplemental Aid that may provide them some additional state funds to increase their income so they actually have more money to help them pay for housing. And they can do that through your county financial office.
Well, if we don't have any other questions, I'm happy to close. And as I said, we don't charge for our technical assistance, so call anytime. I literally got a call last night from a mom in California that found out on our website that if you get a Section 8 voucher and your kids are placed in foster care, and your Section 8 voucher was for 3 bedrooms, you are still getting a Section 8 voucher for 3 bedrooms. Children placed temporarily in foster care are included in HUD's definition of family. And so she found me on the internet and called, and we were able to work it out last night. So do call us, and we'll try to do the best that we can. But we also learn a great deal, as I have said, from the field, and it's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right, at this time, we will take a brief 10-minute break. For our web streamers, we will be back here at 10:45. And again, the bathrooms are to the right. We have a resource table. Help yourself to more coffee and breads, and we'll see you back here soon.
Oh, go ahead. I think you. Oh, there's. Uh-oh. I'm like, how do we? They have them on the table.
Hi, everyone. If we could start making our way back to our seats, and we will get started with our panel.
It's 10 minutes, hey. Less than 10 minutes. It's pretty weird, I don't know. I'm taking my shoes off because I totally like to kick my shoes. Okay, good. Are we playing? Yeah. I was like, they were like, why are her feet moving like that?
I think so. I'm trying.
Wow. We're going to be broadcast all over.
It's pretty weird. Probably should have woke up a little sooner.
Need coffee? Need coffee?
No, I'm okay. I just look a little crazy.
So in Roseville, where are we going?
You look bright and springy.
My work clothes.
Okay.
Oh, you like it?
Dressed like I'm going to the gym. Yeah. It's hard.
Sounds hard.
Wow.
Overnights are no joke.
Yeah, I work like
I never, I mean,
4 to 4 usually. My schedule is 5 to 3:30.
yeah.
When I worked at the shelter at Avenues, we store at 11 p.m. to 7, 8 a.m.
And you're going to be able to get back?
After the sun rises, I'm just like, my body doesn't want to go to sleep, but I'm so exhausted and I never got a good sleep. It was hard.
Oh, wow.
It's really hard.
Yeah, I'm sure out of 10 people, somebody's
You're
going
young,
back
you can handle it.
towards, if not, somebody's going to figure it out. Like,
Yeah, if not, I could figure it out.
okay, gotcha.
They're starting to hire again.
Yeah, but
so,
I'm
and there's a shuttle from Cedar Riverside that goes there, so people are looking for jobs.
Oh, okay.
Overnight start at
In like a month?
$14 an hour.
Oh, my goodness.
That's good to know.
Day shift is 13.
Wow, you're just like,
It feels like it,
But they're going to start. Well, they already have started hiring, but they're going to be mass hiring
so
for
what are
the
you
next couple months.
most excited about now?
Again.
And where's the...
Sure.
It's in Shakopee, but there's a shuttle from Cedar Riverside that's free.
That's what I do.
Man, you're a caretaker, a nurse.
And there is
so
a bus,
amazing.
but
You
from
have to
Burnsville Transit Center, I think.
I'm like really excited.
The shuttle's better.
To actually graduate.
You said it's in Shakopee?
This is the
And they
stuff
have
you
full
gotta
benefits
share.
on day.
Oh my
Okay, I'm
wow.
trying to give you a little bit of it.
I did not know you were gonna be finishing next butt.
Yeah,
Like,
next
wow.
And their insurance
Man,
is killer.
amazing.
Yes. It
So
is.
like, I don't know, for you,
Are they
like,
doing
you know,
full-time,
I don't even
only
know where you
full-time?
were
'Cause you do a
5
lot of
years ago,
overtime.
but
Oh,
Yeah,
did you,
they have
you know,
part-time.
did you ever
weekends,
think
but
that
it's 2 10-hour
you
days
would be
for part-time or 4 10-hour days.
doing what you're doing now, or just,
I
you know,
didn't. I
life
had
would be-
doubts.
People who don't
I
make
had
sure
doubts.
they have
I did
reduced
not
time.
know.
And
I
it's
know what I
Thursday,
wanted.
Friday,
but I
Saturday,
didn't
12
think
hours.
it was possible.
Oh my god,
Okay, cool.
that's so amazing.
It is, yeah.
I will share the
It's
news.
hard. It is hard, but
Do you think youth that are struggling can pull it off?
Oh
because,
wow.
like, the time off you can use like
Thanks
that
for warning
freely,
us.
So if you have a bad day and you don't come to work until you run out, then you then you shut for every single
And
day.
then you're...
All right, everybody, welcome back. If you haven't already, please take your seat, and we're going to get started with our panel. And I will explain a little bit how our panel will go today. We have 4 panelists with us today who are so thankful can join us. And the way we will do this is I'm going to introduce all 4 panelists, and we will give each panel member 10 minutes of time to share their various perspectives and insights on housing and the impact of housing and homelessness on child well-being. And at the end of that, we will have 20 minutes or so of question and answer time from our individual and on-site group web streamers, off-site group web streamers, and then folks on-site. So be thinking of questions that you have, and we will save that for the end of the presentation. So to introduce our panelists today, we have Ryan Berg, who is a program manager at Avenues for Homeless Youth, and also the author of No House to Call My Home, Love, Family, and Other Transgressions, which we've included a handout in your folders if you're interested in learning more about his book. We also have Kizzy Downey, who is the Director of Community Services for Model Cities here in the Twin Cities, and Noor Tamimi, here to share more about her experience as a parent, and Sarah Fink, who is here to share more about her experiences and insights as a youth. So I will let you all take it away. We'll start with Ryan and just kind of go down the row.
Great, thanks so much. Can everybody hear me? All right. Thanks for having me. This is fantastic to be a part of. So I am the program manager for the Connect Host Home program of Avenues for Homeless Youth. I'll talk a little bit about the work that we do at Avenues and specifically about Host Home and why I feel like it's an important community-based intervention for young people who are experiencing housing instability or homelessness. So Avenues has been around for over 20 years. We have 2 site-based programs in the Twin Cities, one in Minneapolis and then one in Brooklyn Park. We work with young folks ages 16 to 20 in the shelters, and they receive full case management, health and wellness supports, 24-hour support through youth counselors. And then we also had a new program this year called Avenues for Young Families, which supports young folks 18 to 24. This is a rapid rehousing program for young families. And then we have 4 host home programs that I'm a part of. The first is the GLBT host home program that started in 1997. It's at 20th anniversary this coming fall, which is pretty exciting. And that was started by the community, basically. So the community, the LGBT community recognized that there were a scarcity of services and supports for young folks who are experiencing homelessness that are queer and trans identified, and decided to do something about it. And so, long story short, they had a feasibility study done and recognized that host home could be a potentially good model for the community. And then hired Rocky Samois at the time at YouthLink and now at Avenues for Homeless Youth. And so Rocky really is the one who shaped the host home model that we use in the Twin Cities, and that is being used across the country as well. So some important things to know about host home. It's a community-based response to homelessness. It's outside the system, and we keep it intentionally small. We have 4 separate host home programs instead of one kind of large program, and that's to ensure that the kind of intimate interactions and relationship building can take place within our programs. Our homes are not licensed, and that's on purpose. Through that feasibility study, we recognized community, right, is really an essential kind of piece and component to a young person moving into stability and in their lives. So in 2011, the Suburban Host Home Program was born out of the West Hennepin Youth Task Force. And that was, again, a community-based initiative, right? The community recognized that in the suburbs, there's a scarcity of services, that young people were migrating into the city to find shelter, to receive services. And in doing so, they had to navigate unfamiliar streets. They were vulnerable to exploitation. So how can we keep young people in the communities in which they identify as home? And the host home model is one way to do that. So that task force partnered with Avenues and created the Suburban Host Home Program. The following year, the Minneapolis Host Home Program started. And then last year, we started the Connect Host Home Program, which works with young folks that are queer and trans identified, ages 16 to 24. And it's a short-term host home program. So the other 3 programs are transitional living programs. The average stay is about a year. With Connect, we're utilizing it as more of a emergency housing, right? So the average stay is going to be between 1 week and 3 months. And that's for queer and trans youth. It's short-term, and it's an intentional partnership with Reclaim, which does mental health supports and services for young folks. So I'll just run through some really important factors around host home and why it's important within the community. So why host home? It's a safer transition-like housing program. It's rooted in community, and it's non-institutional. Many young people who have come through the foster care system are experiencing homelessness. 2 major complaints that they may have: one, a person was paid to care for me, and secondly, I had no say in where I got to stay. So with the host home program, we flipped that. Young people get to read the applications of the hosts. Hosts don't read the applications of the youth. So it gives agency to that young person, and they become an active participant, right, in their own lives. We don't use placement language, we use matching language. It's a volunteer program on all sides, right? So youth have to want to be a part of the program as well as the hosts. And then also it's a volunteer program. So hosts are not being paid to care for young folks. On occasion, we'll have a need for some financial assistance from a host, so we can provide maybe some support around like a bill. You know, if the water bill is getting a little too out of control, we can provide some support there on a case-by-case basis. It's a cost-effective program. It's community-based. It's volunteer-based. Our budgets really are around my salary and then some really kind of basic functioning needs of the program. And then there are the really kind of intangible, kind of the icing on the cake components to host home, which is relationship, right? We know that young people thrive when they feel connected. So many young people, especially if they've been through foster care, have gone through placement to placement to placement, and attachment disorders begin to develop. Building caring, consistent relationships with healthy adults is a critical and important piece, as we all know, and host home really does foster that. So it's transformational not only for the young people and the hosts, but it's really transformational for the community as well. How do we operate? We're outside the system. We recruit, screen, and train and support community volunteers, and then they provide the short-term supportive housing and food for the youth. Program managers support hosts, so we have regular contact with Connect. I meet with hosts weekly. We do weekly home visits with the other 3 transitional programs. It's monthly home visits, and the case manager meets with a young person weekly or as needed. Youth are referred to us through our partnering agencies, schools, county workers, community advocates. Sometimes they self-refer. And youth receive the ongoing case management and support from their case manager. We do a lot of community outreach, and that's how we find our hosts within the community. To become a host, there's screening, there's application process, and we do 16 hours of training that covers the gamut: positive youth development, trauma and resiliency, gender and transgender 101. We live in Minnesota, where the vast majority of young people who are able to host are white, and the vast majority of young people we're working with are youth of color. We do a lot of work on power and privilege, and what that means. We recognize and identify that power dynamic is very skewed in a host home environment. What can we do to equal out that balance? And then we have the hosts focus on themselves, self-reflection exercises, again, that power and privilege piece. We do an implicit bias awareness training as well. And then we have a panel of young people who come in who've experienced the host home program, and a panel of hosts. The key features: we have ongoing training and support by the program manager. We do calls and meetings as needed, and a monthly support group for hosts. We don't call it a support group because they wouldn't come if it was called a support group, so we call it a network. And hosts get to come and talk about some of the challenges, what's working, what isn't, and then every third network is a training that they decide they'd like to maybe have a refresher on. So maybe it's what's trauma-informed care, harm reduction, it's a little fuzzy, can we get a deeper dive in that? And we work on that. We're intensive and flexible, right? We're small by design. That means that if issues come up, we're able to work on them in the moment. For example, right now, we're meeting with a host and a youth twice a week for home visits because that's what's needed at the moment. So we're able to adapt. We don't have a typical 9-to-5 kind of work schedule. It's kind of whenever the need arises. So we meet youth in the moment. And we meet them where they're at, and that means both physically and emotionally. We have care for referrals for the program. So for the longer term programs, youth have to meet with a case manager for up to a month. prior to being referred into the program to ensure that they'd be a safe fit. For the emergency housing program Connects, we do something called the VI SPDAT, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, as part of the assessment tool to ensure that it'd be a safe fit for the young person. And I'll close on this. I know this was a rapid kind of call of the subject, but I'll close with this. Things to consider with hosting. All relationships are magical and messy. Hosting is no exception. It's a leap of faith for everyone on all sides. Part of my job as a program manager and Rocky's job is to help hosts manage their expectations, right? To understand that maybe our life experience won't be the same as a young person who's experiencing housing instability, and we need to check ourselves on occasion. We need to be clear on our boundaries and recognize our issues and our triggers, hosts, youth, and workers, and do self-work. We need to talk about assumptions, power, and privilege, especially when we're talking about that host-youth dynamic. So to end it, for our program, kind of our little mantra has been really to communicate, train as much as we can, support hosts and young people in that relationship building experience, listen and challenge each other, and repeat. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm Sarah. I was a youth in the LGBT host home program a couple of years ago, so I haven't been there for a while, but I guess I got connected to the LGBT host home program after I stayed in a couple of shorter term shelters. I stayed at Safe House for a while. I was at the Bridge for a while, and then I was at Avenues where I met Rocky, who is the director of the host home program. Still, right? Yeah. And was at the time. So I met her there, and then I had my own case manager that I was working with at the Bridge. And so through Rocky and that person, I started the application process and the waiting process and stayed at Avenues for probably I think 8 months before something actually opened up in the host home program. And Ryan said that they're you kind of get to choose your host, which is true, sort of. At the time, there was only one host family available. So, I mean, of course, I could have chosen to not take that family and stay at Avenues until somebody else came up. But I read their application. They had done host home before, so it was their first time doing it as a couple, though, so it's kind of cool. And I got to read about them and their, bad things they've done and good things they've done, and it was kind of interesting to read that. And then I sat down with them with my case manager. We kind of talked about what they were looking for, what I was looking for, and there's kind of two ways I feel like it goes, the family setting and they want to be parents kind of, or a roommate kind of thing, and that's definitely more what I was leaning towards. I didn't really need parents, but I definitely wanted some supportive people, a safe place to stay, things like that. So we talked about that, and we both seemed okay with that idea. So then we went out for pizza, and we went to the mall, and they're an older couple. They're in their 50s, and they got on a roller coaster with me and had a good time. So we hit it off pretty well, and then from there, I ended up moving into their house. So they picked me up at Avenues, they grabbed my stuff, and it was a holiday weekend, so that was a little bit weird to navigate too. So balancing them and my new chosen family, I guess you could say, and balancing the holiday with my family who I kind of still talk to at the time, but it was a little bit rough. So I don't know, that's kind of how that went. And then I stayed with them. Their names are Mike and Kim. I don't know. I stayed with Mike and Kim for probably about a year, and then I was working, I was doing my own thing, and I kind of fell off and ended up having to go to treatment for a while. So they supported me through that. They were there at treatment. They came, visited me, all of that good stuff. But after we decided that they were ready for, to move on to something else in their life, but Rocky still let me stay in the host home program, and I stayed with a different family with different expectations. So some things that were kind of hard for me, I guess, living with Mike and Kim for the first time, first time in host home, I guess, is going from shelters and programs to living with them. There's shelters have very clear set expectations, if you break this rule, you can't stay here. And host home doesn't really have such clear on paper expectations, so you kind of set those with your host, and you guys kind of get to decide what that looks like. And I don't know, that was definitely different for me, and that was kind of hard for me to navigate. Like, I didn't know what was okay, what wasn't, like what was I going to get kicked out for, what was I, like what was okay. Like one time I accidentally got a brand new oven and I didn't do anything, I just opened the door and it shattered and broke. So I packed my bag and I was ready to go the next morning. But Mike and Kim were like, it's okay, like it's a warranty. They came and fixed it the next day. It wasn't that big of a deal, but I thought for sure I was gonna have nowhere to go. So when I stayed with the second host home after going to treatment, it was a little bit more, well, a lot more strict. So there was much more like clear expectations, like this is what needed to be done. I had to go to day treatment, be working my job, be doing whatever, checking in with them a lot more, like know where I was, checking in with my case manager more often. And so that worked better for me the second time around. Like I don't know, it was a big change for me, like the shelter to host home the first time. So I guess, I don't know, host home was a great experience for me overall. Like I still talk to all of the host families I stayed with. I still talk to Mike and Kim. I consider them my dads. I call them that. So we go out to dinner sometimes. I still talk to them. They tell me, I don't know, they do like more stuff in a week than I probably do in like 6 months. So it's kind of hard to keep up with them. Like they're very busy social people, but I still talk to them. I, talk to them on holidays. I gave them a Father's Day present, like all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of cool. Like I didn't really have any like relationships outside of youth work, like before host home, with any like adults or, I don't know, I guess, whatever you want to call them. So that's kind of nice for me. Like my relationships with them are a lot different than anything I've had with anybody else in my life ever. So my family, friends, youth workers, whatever. So it was nice to have like people who I could keep with me forever. Like youth workers are gonna come and go and age out and everything else. So that's something I really like about host home program. I don't know, what else should I go through? I still stay connected a little bit, even though I'm like old now and aged out. But I worked at Caribou for a while, so I was hiring some of the youth that worked in Ryan's program and in the LGBT host home program. And I'm not gonna lie, a lot of them didn't last very long, but I gave them a chance and they came and worked and got jobs, so I stayed connected that way. And I go with Rocky still to the panel sometimes for the trainings and stuff on weekends, so that's kind of cool to stay connected with them like that. And I've gone with Rocky to lots of host interviews before they even get to the training process, and go decide if they're good fits for host home and stuff. So I don't know, I even now still stay connected, still talk to them, still do what I can. So I don't know, I don't really have anything else to say. So you can go. Thanks.
Hello everyone, my name is Noor Tamimi, and it's my pleasure to be here to share with all of you a little bit about me and my experience and my family experience in homelessness. I am a single mother of 5 children, and we went through homelessness a few years back, where we stayed at a shelter that I was fortunate to be able to find a place to take a big family. And that was a very challenging time in my life and my kids' life. It was a lot of new rules, different people that we didn't know. Our sleep was interrupted by people walking in the room at night to kind of like do the night walks and check on everyone. My kids missed having, like a homemade meal or having a friend over. And their school routine was interrupted, and this whole period lasted about a year. So with time, we did get adjusted a little bit to the whole new routine and life. But for me as a mother, it was very challenging to face that, because I really wanted to provide to my children like the roof over their head, safety, security, education. So from the homeless shelter, I was able to get into a transitional housing. It took a while because we had a big family. And then I went to Model Cities, and it was a great opportunity there. My kids went on to their school. Right now, their ages ranges from like 7 years, and my son is going to be 18 next month. So we all were able to find stability in our life and go on to school, and it wasn't easy. It was really hard. So about 5 years ago, I didn't have a current job, like a stable employment. I didn't have a stable home. But after a lot of hard work and support from the community, I was able to go back to school and work on my nursing degree. And I'll be graduating this spring from a practical nursing program at St. Paul College. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's such an achievement for me and my kids to show them it's possible to go to school, it's possible to overcome your challenges. And I am the first one in my family, first female to actually attend college. So that was super challenging to do. Thank you so much. So throughout my time in the past few years, I stayed motivated by kind of looking at finding that stability for my kids. They pushed me into the positive, way to do things for them. And also, all the support system I had from model cities, the caseworkers there, they were very supportive. And with the community, I was able to find the stability in our life. I really don't know. I mean, there's a lot of things I would like to share, but I'll just leave that for you if any of you had any more questions later. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to share a few more things, Noor, because I think you've forgotten some things. This woman is definitely an inspiration, not only to, I'm sure, her kids and to the community, but also to us, the folks that, at Model Cities. While Noor was in our program, she wasn't, she was a resident, but she was also volunteering at her kids' school, getting into college, doing 100-mile bike rides. She does a lot. So you are definitely, I'm very proud and happy for you and for you to be where you are now. So, thank you so much. So I'm going to talk a little bit about model cities and kind of just some perspectives that I have in working with families during the time that I've been at Model Cities. Model Cities is a local nonprofit organization. We've actually been around 50 years. So this year we're celebrating our 50th anniversary as an organization in the community. And our mission is to promote the social and economic prosperity by providing access to opportunities that stabilize and develop families and communities. And really what that means is that we do whatever it takes to get people to the next level. So in terms of who we serve, in 2016, about 55% of the folks that we serve are under the age of 22 years old. So a lot of families with young children. About 80% of the folks we serve identify as people of color, with the majority of those being African American. About 63% of the families we serve are African American. And then about 65% of the households we serve have incomes that are at or below 50% of the area median income, which I think is about $43,000 for a family of four. So not a lot of resources per se, but as you can tell, people with a lot of ambition, a lot of drive, a lot of people that just need opportunities in order to work on the goals that they want for themselves and their families. In terms of some of the work we do, obviously, as Noor mentioned, our organization does provide supportive housing. We've been doing that since 1992. I don't even know if it was called supportive housing back in 1992, but we provide apartment units along with case management services for families who are experiencing homelessness. We have two programs. One is for young adults, ages 17 to 25, who are parenting a child under the age of 3 years old. And then we have another housing program called Families First, which the families in that program are typically a little bit older, a household member typically has some kind of disabling condition, and maybe 50% of the families served in Families First have experienced chemical dependency issues as well. In addition to the housing programs, Model Cities also does an array of services. We work with youth who are on probation in Ramsey and Dakota counties. We also provide like home ownership services for folks who are looking to buy a home for the first time. So that's one of the things I really love about the work that we do as an organization, because it gives people the opportunity to move from one spectrum. You could have a family who literally came in one of your housing programs who's now moving into home ownership. That's another thing you didn't talk about, is that you're also doing some pre-purchase counseling for home ownership services as well.
I am. I'm working with a caseworker or somebody that supports and helps on building credits. I never had a credit. I didn't know what credit was all about. And so I was able to get my credit report and find things I've never knew about. And since then, my credit had really improved, and I'm really working on hopefully one day buying a house for me and my family, so where we can live stable for a long time.
Yeah. So just some insight that I guess I've picked up over the time that I've worked in this area. I kind of started out working in youth programming, so I had a totally different perspective of what I thought my passion was. I enjoy working with youth because I felt like sometimes when you're working with families, it's easy to ignore or to miss the needs of the little people or the young people that are in that household, because we're so busy trying to work with mom or dad or the adults in the household to make sure that they're stable. So for me, working with youth was kind of the route that I thought I would always go. But then as I kind of advanced and started doing more work in nonprofit, I had an opportunity to work with one of our housing programs and really got a chance to see kind of the dynamics of families, and when they've experienced lots of trauma, and especially like homelessness, it definitely gives you a different perspective on how families kind of get to the place that they are. At the same time, it makes you not necessarily judge them, because for a family like Noor, you see them the day they show up at your program, but you never know 3 years later that they're going to be graduating from a nursing program and that their kids are going to be graduating from high school. So it really does, it makes the work a lot more, I don't know the word, it makes it a lot easier, because sometimes this work is hard. I don't know if you all have worked in housing or working with families who've experienced homelessness, but it's not always an easy thing to see, because families are coming from a lot of trauma and a lot of negative experiences, and you want to immediately help them to kind of be better, but it is a process. And so even the housing that we provide for them, that's just a tool, but then they still have to go through the process of healing and the process of figuring out what it is they want to do. And so we're just folks that are there to help them along the way. Some things that I guess I've taken away from this work is you really do have to have empathy, and that's not like feeling sorry for people. There's a difference. People don't need you to feel sorry for them. They need you to believe in them, but to also resonate with their experience. It might be different than my experience, but we've all had challenging experiences. And so I've learned that when I can at least kind of understand where a person is and where they're trying to be, it's easy for them to trust me as a person and trust that I want to, be a part of their journey to be able to move forward. And then the other thing I'll just say is that as a provider, as a housing provider, there's a huge need out there for housing, but not just a place to stay. Like people, you could build 1 million apartment buildings or houses and put people in there, but if they don't have the support and the resources that they need in order to, become more stable, you're literally just warehousing people. And so I know a lot of the challenges that we face as an organization and that other providers might face is this lack of funding to support the service work that you do. A lot of funders want to fund facilities, but not necessarily the work. And so I would just always like to make the case that you really do need to be able to provide services for people, because that's what's going to help them move to the next level. So thank you.
So at this time, we'll take questions. We have a couple mics here on site. All right, got a question.
Kizzy, I so appreciated you talking about how to kind of stand in solidarity with people facing a crisis, recognizing trauma. And one of the things that I really appreciate about the work that's happened in the child welfare space is recognizing that that nobody should be reduced to their deficits or just the traumas that they've confronted, but really appreciated the way you spoke to resilience and strength and aspirations. And so I'm just wondering, kind of across the panel, if you can speak a little bit to the way that as our systems kind of evolve and get stronger at ending homelessness, what we can do to really foster that resilience and understanding of trauma without reducing anybody to just their deficits or their traumatic experience.
Well, I guess I could start. Thank you for the question and the comment. I mean, one thing that I would say is that we have to be advocates, but not just for people. We have to bring them into the space, because a lot of times I think we like to tell people's story, and people can tell their own story. And someone who's experienced homelessness, they can do a much better job of helping others to understand what is needed and what their struggles were. So I think we all try to do good by being able to advocate for folks, but I would just say in addition to doing that, we also need to create opportunities for people to be able to tell their own stories as well. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think, telling your own stories, giving that's an empowering tool. I think also, being as strengths-based as possible in the relationship building that we're doing. So, recognizing the journey of the person you're working with, and I think. So I work outside of the system. We are, we don't have, as Sarah had mentioned, really kind of structured guidelines around what would preclude someone from being a part of the program. It's really about relationship building, and that can be the messy part of relationships. And I think honoring that is a really kind of important aspect, being really clear around when you're building a relationship with someone you're working with, what are your boundaries? Be clear about your boundaries, be clear in your communication on all sides, right? And I think that can be a really great tool in strengthening and building relationships. Sarah, anything? No? Okay. Does that speak to your question? Yeah. Okay.
We've got one right up front.
I have one from Kimberly from Facebook. She asks, what about housing for teen parents?
For teen parents?
Sorry, for teen parents. Just Kimberly from Facebook wants to know, what about housing for teen parents?
I know one of the programs I mentioned that Model Cities provides are Sankofa apartments. It is specifically designed for youth, young adults ages 17 to 25 who are parenting a child under the age of 3. So it is a much different experience working with youth who are parenting, because their needs are different. For a lot of them, and then the Sankofa program that I mentioned is for youth who've experienced, who are considered long-term homeless, so they meet the state's definition of long-term homelessness. You'd be amazed at how many 17-year-olds have already meet the state's definition of long-term homelessness. But there aren't a lot of programs out there, but there's definitely a need. And ours is a small program. We have about 15 units of housing for those young parents, and then they also come with case management services as well. So.
Yeah, there's a scarcity of services for young parents out there. Host home, we do have hosts who will host a young parent. Obviously, that's a case-by-case kind of situation, and it would really kind of require a longer conversation with the young person who's parenting and the hosts in the program about what services and supports. As Sarah mentioned, some hosts really just, it's kind of a roommate situation. So the level of involvement really is just being there, caring, and consistent. And so it would be a real intentional conversation around what level of support that young parent may need. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Avenues does have a new program, Avenues for Young Families, which works with parenting youth who are around rapid rehousing.
I wanted to thank you all for sharing your experiences and your stories. My comment question maybe follows up with what the other gentleman had talked about earlier from a resilience standpoint and a strength standpoint. It's very noticeable to me as you, as service providers, as you talk, you're talking about the people that you work with or that you're partnering with or standing with on this journey and not calling people clients. And I'm aware as we work in this field that we use that language, and language is important, and the inherent kind of power shift that creates. So my question to you is that purposeful? And how does that work across your agency in terms of instilling that kind of relationship building and attitude toward removing those barriers? Because I think that language creates barriers for us.
That's a really good question. You want to start?
Sure.
Okay.
I think it's definitely become more intentional for me. My background is not as a social worker or someone who's necessarily provided direct service beyond the work I did with youth. And so I serve in more of a programmatic administrative role, but yet, again, it's that sense of empathy and being able to connect with families. So it sometimes can be a struggle, like even as we're doing like board presentations or talking with staff who aren't necessarily working directly with the families that we serve, like being intentional about how we refer to them as our families, but not trying so hard not to use client or participant, or like they're not a subject of an experiment. They are families who are here to like better their lives. But it definitely can be challenging to like change the way people think about the families that we serve. So, and it's not just like I said, it's from across all levels within the organization. It can be challenging. So,
it's a very intentional choice. I think host home program in particular really comes from the angle of solidarity rather than charity, and so we really do recognize that a lot of young people have come through institutions and have had negative relationships to institutions and experiences. We really are community-based and really about building relationship, and I think naming or labeling a young person I'm working with as a client, it feels kind of clinical and distancing. And so I think ways in which we can be youth-centered and youth-driven, part of that is to honor them as individuals and as people, and so we try to do that as much as possible.
Do we have any other questions on site or web stream, social media?
we were that good. There are no more
Answered
questions.
all of your questions.
We rock.
Could I ask a quick kind of question to Sarah and Noor? Because I hear and see both Ryan and Kizzy talking about the importance of voice and empowerment and bringing parents and youth back, to the table, into these spaces that maybe are normally inaccessible or, barriers to getting there. If from your perspective, is that empowering for you? Do you find that helpful does it increase your interest or make you want to do more work, whether it's with youth or parents? Just kind of any more thoughts you have on like that impact for you in being able to share your stories and be in these spaces, if you have any comments.
I guess so I've been in a lot of programs, like a lot. So I don't know, I feel like it definitely I feel like it does have an impact on me, like the way that I was treated in host home and like even at Avenues, like versus like I was at the Pride Institute for treatment, or like even at like with a case manager that I had with another service and things like that. I don't know, I felt like a lot more like, I don't know, I felt like I was like partnering with Rocky and partnering with Claire and partnering with us. Like, I don't know, I felt like they were like, I don't know, they were more than just like that, like caseworker. Like I wouldn't just like check in with them. Like I felt like they really cared about like me as a person, and they knew a lot about me, and they would like call me on my, you know, whatever BS and stuff like that. And like, I don't know, I definitely do think like if I heard Claire talk to me, like talk about me as like a client, that definitely would change like my like attitude, and it would change like how I would want to talk to her and what I would say. I don't know, I know they're not my friends, but I kind of felt like, you know, there was a different connection that I had with host home people versus, you know, case managers elsewhere and programs elsewhere and things like that. It was like, I don't know, kind of was like a family for me, I guess, my host home family. I don't know. Yeah, I think it does make a difference.
I would like to share also, so the relationship I was able to build with my caseworkers at Model Cities, for example. Throughout my time there, I had different experiences as I had different caseworkers. There was times when I felt like I was being judged. I was just simply being judged by how I looked or by where I came from. And I didn't like that at all. But then there was also times when I was listened to, I was cared about, I was able to talk and share my experiences. So it's really not as easy to be able to talk about, your experiences, or because when you're in a supportive housing, there's a lot of personal information that you usually share and talk about, and that was kind of different. It was new. So it took a while to kind of be able to open up and talk about things and share. But it was really supportive to have somebody to listen and ask questions and listen just in a non-judgmental way, and kind of try to get you involved in the community and offer you resources and ways that you can be involved. I thought that was very important.
Yeah, I think I'll just add a little bit to that. I think I just was thinking about home visits, and when we sit at home visits and are talking about an issue, we come as a community to problem solve together, and it's not prescriptive. It's really principles based and really hearing all sides, and I think that's a really essential component to. I think in foster care world, we always talk about reunification with family or living independently, and who lives independently, right? It's about community, so and engagement. So I think part of being youth-driven and part of being youth-centered is about learning how to build up that community.
So yeah, I'm just saying one thing. So with the home visits too, I liked how host home had things. It was really informal kind. I don't know, we would talk over dinner or go have coffee or something like that. So it didn't feel like it was always an intentional meeting. So and I do think that you're right, that we kind of solve things as a group and things, and I don't know. Sometimes it went well, sometimes it didn't. Rocky said I'm one of the two youth that she's had to yell at in her whole career, so I guess that's an achievement for me. But I don't know. I just like the informality, and it just felt I don't know, a group thing and not an intentional client meeting. So.
Thank you. I think we have another question.
Yes, it's been my experience that folks who have a criminal history or criminal justice involvement have had more difficulty in finding and maintaining housing. Can you speak to that and any work that you've done or are doing surrounding helping folks that have criminal history?
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's the unfortunate reality of the world we live in, right? Youth who are experiencing homelessness or housing instability, they're often criminalized, just trying to survive. We often are working with young folks with some kind of record. We don't do a deep dive into youth's history or past. If they're coming to us and are in need of resources, we're working with them. As far as finding housing after host home, the case manager will work with them on any level that's needed to ensure that all housing options are looked at. But yeah, that's oftentimes a huge challenge and barrier and a frustration, right? And oftentimes youth are just like, I want to screw it, I don't want to do this. It's too frustrating. So just being that support and trying to provide that guidance and recognizing, yeah, this is incredibly frustrating, and our system really sucks when it comes to supporting folks who have had a criminal past. As far as like actual tangible resources, it's really, it's a case-by-case kind of situation with young people and the unique challenges that they're facing. We have, relationships with different folks who provide legal advice, and there are certain housing programs that would kind of look over those kind of issues and recognizing that the youth may have support from the agency, from a case manager, and they may be able to overlook some of those marks on their record.
Yeah, I would just say for our housing programs at Model Cities, we practice a housing first approach, so we don't have barriers to people getting housing. At the same time, because our supportive housing programs are also connected with the St. Paul Housing Agency, we have project-based vouchers on several of the units. It does become a little bit of a issue because we might welcome them in and say, tell us about all your criminal history. The more we know, the better. And from a how do we work with you moving forward perspective. But then once that family gets referred to the housing authority to process their paperwork so that they can come into our program, we've had several situations where the family ended up getting denied access to our program because they had things that showed up in their criminal history that they forgot to mention or that they really didn't think about or they didn't realize they had an open warrant. So there definitely are still issues around criminal activity and people's histories. And for me, I just really think that, housing is like a human right for everybody. So regardless of your, past, everybody deserves the right to have a safe place to live. But it's kind of hard to figure out how to work around that because, like I said, our program, it's subsidized. The units are subsidized by this, by the housing agency, and they kind of make the final decision when it comes to people's backgrounds. So.
Can I sneak in? Sorry, from Facebook. Jessica from Facebook asked, is there a one-stop website that lists all of the housing resources mentioned by the panelists for the entire metro area? And if one is not familiar with these housing resources, how can they access them?
There's ysnmn.org. It's an app and a website, and it shows all resources, housing resources, food shelf, medical, drop-in centers for young folks. And it's incredibly useful because it has GPS on it as well, and it's supposed to be telling young people what beds are available in real time. So if you're closer to avenues and you look to see that there's a bed open, you can give a call right then and there. That's a great resource for young folks. It doesn't include all programs. It doesn't have host home is not included in that because of the referral process is a little different. It's not host home, for the exception of Connect, isn't emergency shelter. But it's ysnmn.org is a great resource.
And I was just gonna say you can always go to the like Heading Home Ramsey and I'm assuming Heading Home Hennepin's web pages, but they should list all the providers, at least housing providers in each county. So that might be another good tool. If you just Google Heading Home Ramsey or Heading Home Hennepin, you'd be able to find those websites pretty easily.
Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, we have someone waiting patiently in the back with a question.
Well, thank you all very much. This is a question for each of you. If each of you had a magic wand and you could positively impact this issue of homelessness and child and youth well-being, how would you use it?
Man.
Thanks. Wow. So we have over 6,000 young people experiencing homelessness on any given night in the state of Minnesota. We could have 6,000 beds tonight and we'll still have homelessness tomorrow because we haven't addressed the racial and economic disparities and injustices that are leading predictors to homelessness. So I think as service providers, we also need to be working from a social justice lens and working with community organizers and not just working within the silos of our organizations, but really working within community relationships. So it's not just about community outreach, right, but community engagement to really address and tackle those issues. That's a huge question,
I know.
but that's where I'll leave it there.
I agree with Ryan. I don't know what else to say. I mean, yeah, I think it definitely has to be, creating more programs, creating more housing isn't gonna necessarily fix the problem. There's a root issue that has to be addressed. So if I had the magic wand, it would be to hit the root issue and fix it from the bottom up. So, yeah.
I have another one. As panelists talk, there seems to be separation from child welfare services and after aging out. Can you speak to the collaborative work you do, if any, with child protection agencies and families actively receiving child welfare services?
I was thinking about that earlier when Ruth was talking. This kind of separation between homeless youth services and child welfare. I used to be in child welfare. I worked as a caseworker in New York for a while, working with youth, and we had a very kind of tenuous relationship with homeless youth workers. Mm-hmm. And now on this side, working kind of outside the system and working with homeless youth, I can say that I have a very limited relationship with child welfare workers. I do have a great relationship with folks at the state and folks in the county. But as far as direct service workers, there isn't really that, from my perspective, that relationship. I think there's a lot of room to grow and foster how we can build those connections and really kind of work towards creating more of a foundation of stability for young folks who are transitioning out. I think you were kind of hitting on how we are reactionary, right? And the work that we do is really reacting to a situation and reacting and creating a response to an issue instead of really being proactive and how can we be preventative? And I think a really great way in doing that is building those relationships between systems and community workers.
Yeah, I would kind of agree with what Ryan was saying. At the same time, I know that we do experience quite a few families that come into our housing programs who have an active child protection case open, and so housing is sometimes kind of what they need in order for there to be any kind of form of reunification. So that puts a lot of pressure on a provider because at one point you want to provide that housing opportunity. At the same time, you want to make sure that the child welfare workers aren't going to just close the case and move on, and then you've taken this new family and you're not sure kind of what the dynamics are. So I know that we try really hard to make those workers a part of that team so that we're really communicating about housing needs and issues with the family, and that we're not just letting them know when there's a problem, but wanting to make sure that we're keeping each other abreast, because it can definitely, we just recently had a situation with a family. They've been in our housing program for about 9 months, and the housing agency, not picking on the St. Paul Public Housing Agency, they're a great partner. At the same time, they were not happy that we had a family who her kids had not been reunified. And so we were saying that, so they were looking to terminate her voucher. And I was like, well, when she came into our program, we were under the impression that there was going to be a plan in place, but it doesn't happen like overnight. We can't just force them to give us a plan just so that they can get housing, but we have to be willing to, I think, be a little bit more flexible in situations where those kinds of issues come up, because families need time. You don't want to just force reunification if the family isn't ready, but there needs to be flexibility in those situations to give families the opportunity to really work through those processes. So you can catch it on both ends. I feel like as a housing provider, you're always trying to make everybody happy, but our goal is to make sure the family isn't lost in the translation of all of this. So.
And to piggyback a little bit on the flexibility aspect, I think I just remembered that host home can be really flexible in terms of working with county workers, and if there is someone who's a young person who is in foster care. For example, we had a young person who a county worker contacted us about a young trans individual who was having a struggle finding a culturally competent home, and wanted to know if host home had any hosts that are interested in fostering and would be willing to go through the process of becoming a foster parent in order to be matched with this young person. So, we can go to our hosts and talk to them about this option. So I think we kind of get caught sometimes in the rigidity, right, of roles and how we see how things can work, but being flexible and trying to ask questions about how we can partner, I think is essential and incredibly important.
Well, thank you, Ryan, Sarah, Noor, and Kizzy again. A round of applause for our panelists today.
Oh, wow.
You can use my microphone if you want.
One more quick plug for Tracy had mentioned at the beginning of the conference that we are on site here today doing interviews with child welfare professionals and providers who have supported parents with disabilities who have been involved with the child welfare system. And we are still taking, if anyone is interested in completing a very brief interview, answering a couple questions about the work that you've done, you can go see our staff at the registration table in the front. And at this time, I'd like to invite up the Executive Director of the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare, Tracy Laliberty, and hopefully the mic is working over there.
Wireless. Okay, thank you. Karina, I just wanted to take a moment. I know that in a moment we're going to have Jamie Sorensen, who is Director for the Division of Child Safety and Permanency in Minnesota, come up and do a little wrap-up for us. And many people who are joining us via web stream will continue to be with us for that. And there are some folks from other states that I know may sign off. So before people do that, I just want to remind people about doing conference evaluations. Those are very helpful to us as we plan for next year's practice conference and being able to have you guys get your CEUs. Beyond that, I wanted to just take a moment and thank the CASCW staff. CASCW is what we call ourselves, the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare. Conferences and events like this are certainly a labor of love for us and part of our mission, but they don't come easy, and a lot of planning goes into the detail around that. And while I get to be the face of that often, it is not my heavy lifting by any means. It's the center staff who I would like to thank, specifically Karina Berry, who has been hosting us so far, as well as Nora Lee, who helps in our front office and gets you all the information that you need. So if you could join me in just thanking the center staff for being able to pull this together. Just a couple of thoughts as the panel had left, and again, before I have Jamie come up, I like the example that Ryan gave at the end in terms of being able to work kind of cross-system and have that flexibility and that reflexivity. I think that it is kind of a glaring thing where we have child welfare over here, child protection services and housing over here, and we send families back and forth, or we send kids back and forth, and it really behooves us, and the ownership, I think, is on us as professionals to build that bridge and to walk with people back and forth. I don't think at this point it's realistic to think we aren't going to have those silos. That's what our funding streams are, and that's largely what our legislation is. And while we can work very hard to make changes in that, we have to recognize that we have those silos, that we have gaps in our service provision, and that families suffer because of those gaps, and that we have to walk with them. We have to help them get from one place to another. My greatest hope is that those 5 jurisdictions that got those Children's Bureau demonstration grants, a tremendous amount of money to be able to make those bridges between housing and homeless services and families actively engaged in child protection, that we'll learn a great deal from those. And that we have great hope to be able to learn how do we best forge those relationships and make them sustainable to be able to help families not only get the housing that we heard about, but the services that go with it, because that's what enables people to be able to make the changes that they need to make, that they want to make, and to be able to stay out of the system. So I think it's great to learn about homelessness and to know our partners in housing services, but we have to do more than that. And I know that our partners across disciplines want to partner with us in child welfare, so we need to be able to make that happen. And the hardest thing sometimes is making the time to make that happen. So that's my hope for you as you leave today, is that you can maybe leave with more questions than you came with, but that you use your critical thinking and your critical conversations back in your offices to think, how can you do it better? How can we do it better? Who are the other people that you want to be taking to lunch and going to coffee with and being able to partner with? Because that's really the only way that we're going to make the system changes and the service changes that we need. The other thing, as a researcher, maybe this will sound weird coming from me, but don't just rely on the research. Much of what happens, good practice, good innovation, happens in communities. We have to learn from communities. The researchers have to take a note from the practitioners. Not everything makes it into the literature. You always hear about this great literature, right? Not everything can go through the rigorous research of an evidence-based practice evaluation. Even evidence-informed has a standard that is difficult to achieve, and it is expensive at times. We have to do it, but in the meantime, while those things are happening, we have to learn from each other. We have to learn what's happening in the field. And as administrators, I challenge you to value that. Don't just value those 3 letters of evidence-based practice, EBP. We've got to learn from what's happening and take some risks to be able to replicate some of those things that we know have promise. So I leave you with those thoughts. And with that, I would like to invite Jamie Sorensen, who is the director for the Division of Safety and Permanency. Did I say that right? I always just shorthand it, and it's close enough. You know, DHS. And Jamie's going to talk through some wrap-up for us.
It's okay if I sit at the table rather than...
You can stand on your head and do it if you want. All right. I think they'll turn it on for you.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. As I get started, I want to thank and acknowledge the amazing work that the child welfare workforce, the child welfare workers, the supervisors, county and tribal, our private partners, for what you do for kids and families throughout the state of Minnesota. This is really tough work, and these have been difficult times. And we worry about your well-being because we understand rising caseloads, and we understand public scrutiny, and we understand the policies and the different requirements that we as the State Department are requiring of you. And so I think it's just really a very special thing anytime we have a chance to talk with our workforce and to have a moment with the collective in terms of Minnesota's child welfare workforce. So we know that there are struggles, and my request of you is to hang in there with us. We are working very hard on your behalf to address your workload and to create structures and systems that will attend to what you need to continue to do this work in the state of Minnesota. I want to cover a few things today. I want to talk a little bit about our thinking related to unaccompanied homeless youth and some of our efforts. I also want to give you a little bit of information about the 2017 legislative session and the work that we've done, what we've tried to accomplish, and where things sit today. And then I want to outline some of the initiatives that we believe are important for us to collectively focus on moving forward. In the housing area, in the unaccompanied youth area, Jacqueline White, who is the director for Minnesota Host Home Network, has reminded me this morning that along with housing and the importance of housing for our youth is the importance of permanent connections. And that is a lens and a philosophy that we cannot forget as we do this work, because those connections for our youth provide them with family, ongoing stability, and many things that many of us take for granted as we walk through our early 20s and 30s and 40s and probably 50s in many situations. So I want to thank Jacqueline for that reminder, and I want us to be thinking about those permanent connections for our youth as well, in addition to the housing needs for these youth. In our work, we at the Child Safety and Permanency Division have been fortunate enough to have Nick Vogel join our staff, and I believe that many of the people in the room who focus on unaccompanied youth and housing are probably familiar with Nick. He comes to us from Hennepin County, and he's just been really suited for this particular work and has a fire in his belly around the needs of these youth and connecting the dots with the different players to bring child welfare better into focus as we talk about homeless youth. I also want to, say thank you to Kathy Tenbrook, who's the State Director to Prevent and End Homelessness, to Eric Grumdahl, who's now the Director of Special Programs with the Department of Education, and then Andrea Simonet in OEO at the state. Very gracious and critical players as we come together to talk about how we can improve our system and advocate and develop resources for these youth at this very vulnerable transition time. In this legislative session, we had put together a collaborative proposal to create a pilot project, or as the feds like us to use now, innovation zones. And so you'll start to hear that terminology coming from us because they have asked us not to use pilot projects, but innovation zones as strategies for trying things out. But it was a project to better create a child welfare response to referrals and reports that come in regarding youth who are unaccompanied or are homeless. And it was a response that would have allowed us to link these youth to regional navigators, to be linked to regional resources and networks and infrastructures. At this point in time, that proposal is not being supported, but that doesn't mean that we don't continue our efforts, and we look for other ways to move forward with this work, and then we come back in subsequent sessions to retool our proposal, provide hopefully new and compelling data, and to have the time between now and the next legislative session to do our networking and to do our work with people in hopes that this is something that will be evolving moving forward. We've done a great deal of work on policy development regarding extended foster care, who's eligible for extended foster care, a great deal of work with regard to youth leadership councils. I understand that I'll be meeting with Youth Leadership Council in the upcoming weeks to hear from them what they would like to see move forward in terms of a sibling Bill of Rights. I know that they're efforting also toward revision of foster care child Bill of Rights, and I think those are really important voices to be leading these particular efforts in Minnesota. In our 2016 screening guidelines, we gave more attention to what county and tribal agencies do with reports regarding older youth. In child welfare, so many reports come through the front door, and oftentimes we're so concerned about younger children. We see them, as very, very vulnerable, which is the right lens. But I think that we diminish, in some respects, the vulnerability of older youth. And when we consider things like trafficking and things that youth can be exposed to, we really need to attend better to those vulnerabilities and not see those older youth as willful misconduct around running away or engaging in unlawful behaviors. I think with these youth that come into the system, we have developed in the guidelines some protocols and some considerations so that they aren't just screened out because of what is perceived as a lack of their vulnerability based on their age and those kinds of variables. When we look at homeless youth, I just think it's very, very sad, and I get very concerned that 7% of the youth population in the United States. And so when we talk about these youth, it's very personal for me. This is my community. And I like the work that we are trying to do and evolve around meeting the needs of this very vulnerable population. So we have reached out to the Human Rights Campaign, and we are considering at this point in time doing an agency assessment toward becoming a GLBTQ competent agency. And I think that's really important because I think it will better attune us to the specific needs and experiences of these youth. We continue to be mindful and address concerns with American Indian youth, African American youth, and how unaccompanied, how they are represented in our population of unaccompanied homeless youth as well. So I think that these are all really great efforts. I think that we can all do more. I don't always think that more money is the solution and that it's going to solve the problem, but in this particular instance, the lack of funds and resources presents a significant barrier to us moving forward and to achieving the very serious and important goals of the federal and Minnesota plans toward ending homelessness. So it's a big deal. And again, I thank Nick and all of our collaborators and other people throughout the Child Safety and Permanency Division and county and tribal welfare private agencies for their work addressing the needs of this population. I have about maybe 8 minutes left, so I'm going to talk a little bit about our legislative session. And I just want child welfare workers and supervisors to know, and people throughout the state to know how hard we are advocating for reduction in caseload sizes, more services and resources, for things like the preschool entry rate, so that more kids in that 0 to 6 age range have the ability to move toward permanency. We are striving to better build our infrastructure to address the needs of and support foster care throughout the state of Minnesota. So I want to go through kind of a list of different legislative pieces and just kind of share with you some of the things that we've followed and some of the things that we've worked on. As people may know, in terms of youth who are sex trafficked, in the last legislative session, we changed statutes so that sex trafficking is synonymous with sexual abuse. And so as a result, those cases or reports need to be received as investigations. And that happens in May of 2017. And so we are trying to prepare guidance and work toward a response track and having that available as a very succinct and planful response, and connecting those youth to advocates and navigators and resources that exist throughout the state of Minnesota. At this point in time, we don't believe that our ideas in that area are moving forward. And so that means for us that we'll have to figure out how we're going to move in that effort without additional resources at this time. The Child Welfare Training Academy, I don't know if people have heard much about the Training Academy, but this was something that came out of the recommendations from the Governor's Task Force. And it's really designed to be a collaborative process with CASCW, University of Minnesota, and the department, and to develop a broader array of curriculums, to have more experiential types of trainings, and to focus on competencies, but also to begin to really address the well-being of the workforce and to address secondary trauma. So that's a proposal that a lot of people worked on, and it's a very good proposal. It's something we're very committed to. We aren't having success with it in this legislative session. And so we will continue to, again, revise, pull data, and try to retool for subsequent submission in the next legislative session. The other recommendation from the task force that was something that we needed to move forward with was a centralized intake system. That currently isn't being supported, and I think that that's okay for now because it gives us maybe a little more time to think and collaborate and retool and develop that in a way that we think is important. So at the end of the day, most of our legislative recommendations were to support the work of child protection workers throughout the state. At this point in time, it doesn't look like much is being supported by the legislature. And so we don't envision receiving resources and dollars and approval on our proposals at this time. So, what do you do in the context of that without, feeling defeated? I think there's a couple of things that we will do and a couple of things that we all can do collectively. I think as we plan for the next session, we're going to, in May, pull our partners together. We're going to collaboratively work on priorities and proposals And should the department not be able to carry something forward, maybe another organization or partner can carry something forward, so that we have our bases covered, so that we're trying to move these items forward from different perspectives of different agencies. I think also something that we're looking at doing now is working with MMB on more results first initiatives with funding through the Pew Charitable Trust, where we really look at what does it cost to provide a best practice or promising practice to a child in Minnesota toward what particular outcome, and to use those expenditures in relation to what you garner in terms of outcomes, so that we can make a case for return on investment. And that's really a bipartisan approach that Senate, House members have really been involved in. And I think if we target that toward child welfare, it'll give us additional leverage in terms of how we put our proposals forward and who's invested in our proposals. Some other kind of top hit things that we're doing, and you'll hear more about this. So when you hear about these things initially today, I don't want you to be alarmed and think that they're far down the road. These are things that we want to begin to think about and to engage people in discussions on, and that is creating a comprehensive child welfare information system in Minnesota. The SSI system is dated, and it's time to look at a system that allows case managers to really automate some of their workflow in the system and to connect to resources and to run cases electronically through a process that makes sense from a case management perspective. We want to address some more work on safe place for newborns, so that we take care of the vital records issue. Right now, as it's structured, it could be difficult for a young person to deliver a baby in a hospital and then subsequently relinquish that infant because a vital record has been created. And so we want to give some attention to that to see if there's some solutions we can come up with. We want to do some revisions to the MAPC. We've gotten a lot of feedback on that. We want to have a conversation about who takes children into custody and places them in foster care in Minnesota. Should it be law enforcement? Should it be a social worker? Should it be a collaboration? And to give some time and attention to that, so that we are working with children in a way that best meets their needs and minimizes any potential trauma. We're working with the Center for States, Capacity Building Center for States, to work on ongoing case management standards. That's a conversation that we will begin with people. We're also looking at our safety tools and process throughout the child protection continuum. We're working to expand initiative tribes, Mille Lacs and Red Lake. So those tribes are in planning grants with us, and we're working to move forward in that direction. And there's many, many other things. And it's hard to cover them all, in one convening. But our work is to really engage child welfare workers and other stakeholders throughout the state whenever we're doing planning and envisioning and trying to evolve and develop the system. So I guess in summary, again, I want to say thanks to the child protection workers, tribal and county and private agencies, and that we are working hard for you, and we will continue to do so. And there's reason to have lots of hope about how our system will evolve and how this work will be done in the state of Minnesota. So is there time for questions, or?
Maybe a couple. It's such a chatty group all day. Does anyone have any questions specifically for Jamie about updates?
Nothing about 24/7.
I have it on good authority he's going to be sticking around for a bit, so you can always corner him over by the coffee too.
You mentioned working with Human Rights Campaign around cultural competency around LGBTQ
yes.
youth. Are you also working with True Colors Fund, or is that kind of in conversation?
That has been a conversation, and Eric Grumdahl was kind enough to connect us with, I can't recall his name, but he's the director of True Colors, when we were in a conference in D.C. Yeah, Gregory Lewis. And I think we're intrigued and interested in that. I think that we have conversations to be had, because when we were talking about it, Initially, part of the conversation was it would be the first time that True Colors would be focusing kind of on a state in its entirety instead of one particular geography. So I would like to. I think that would be amazing. And I would like to hear more about maybe your thoughts about it, other people's thoughts about it, because that would really give us some focus. I think the state of Minnesota is really ready for something like this. And for people who don't know True Colors, it's Cyndi Lauper's organization, and it's focused on homeless youth who are GLBTQ and building infrastructure in particular jurisdictions. And it'd be fun to meet Cyndi Lauper if that were possible. But
can you talk about the ongoing work and are you seeing results in the work on racial equities and addressing the racial disparities within the child welfare system?
Thanks for that question, because that was one of the things I wanted to cover. We put out an RFP born out of the 2015 legislative session that was to really go out to agencies that were serving kids and families who were disproportionately represented in the system and having disparate outcomes. And so we did contract with a number of providers, and for the first time we're getting a glance at what the evaluation of those endeavors have been for the first portion of the time. And so we do have those contracts out there, and I think there's lots of opportunity to further and develop those, but there is some good work being done by a number of agencies that are focused on those grant funds. Additionally, in terms of the American Indian children and families in the state of Minnesota, we talk a lot about disproportionality. We talk a lot about reducing disproportionality. And I think that we want to have some discussion about what that means. What are the contributors? Justine Nelson from Dr. Schiff's area at the department did a social determinants study a few years back, and she was able to identify social determinants that lead to involvement in Minnesota's child welfare system and other systems. And there were things like parental mental health, parental chemical abuse, housing, a family of 4 or more. So a number of variables that contribute to how and why American Indian children and families, African American children and families enter the child protection service system. So when you think about those social determinants, those are not things that we can exclusively solve within the deep end child protection system. We need to be engaging partners to build infrastructure and programs upstream and in collaboration with child protection. So I think for American Indian children, our best efforts are focused on disparate outcomes and to improve outcomes for kids and families. And so we're working with Casey Family Programs right now. We're also working with a few other people. Marvin Davis and I are having conversations about creating a convening in Minnesota, hopefully this fall, probably 3 sessions of a convening, to really do a deep dive into the data with travel partners and with county partners and with state partners and other stakeholders to say, here's the data, can we have some shared understanding about it? Here's why the data is the way it is, can we have some shared understanding about it? And then most importantly, what are some strategies and message points we can share to move this forward? And so I feel really hopeful and good about that. We also participated in the NAACP's Child Protection Day at the Capitol, and we're wanting to have a convening with some of those leaders to talk about what are the possibilities in either policy or practice that we can begin to develop and engage for African American children and families. We have some resources and structures and initiatives focused on American Indian children and families. We want to do more. We don't have as many focused on African American children, and so we really have a great deal of work to do there, because I think that we are really remiss on meeting the needs of those kids and those families.
Please join me in thanking Jamie for his time. So our time has come to an end, and I want to be mindful to try to be as close to on time as we can, because we do have the web viewers. Just a couple things as people are exiting.
Sorry, Tracy.
Again, a reminder to complete your evaluations and collect your CEUs. There are 4 resources I really quickly want to draw your attention to, other than the CW 360 related to the topics that we've talked about today. The first is the Youth Connection Scale, and it was mentioned a little bit up here earlier. It's an instrument that was developed at the center at the University of Minnesota that not only it quantifies and provides a quality assessment of relationships of youth age 15 to 21. And it's a tool that can be used in preparation of kids who are aging out or those kids who are preparing for adulthood who perhaps are not aging out. But it helps them identify who the strength or who the adults, supportive adults in their life are, and what are the things that they can count on those adults for. And it also helps them identify the gaps. So if they know, gosh, I'm going to need somebody to help me with X, Y, Z, this assessment tool allows that conversation and that identification to occur. The second tool I want to talk to you about is called the WITI. It's the Well-Being Indicator Tool for Youth. Both of those tools were developed at the center, and both are youth-driven. The youth completes it. The youth gets to say what gets inputted into that assessment, not the worker, not the parent, not the substitute care provider. So you may disagree with what the youth says, but that's what goes into the tool. The WITI is very simple. It's an online app, and it's 8 questions. And it addresses each domain of well-being. So again, it's about opening a conversation with youth to help them recognize, wow, there are all these things that contribute to my well-being, maybe things that they haven't thought about purpose. Maybe it's about volunteerism or going to school. But often in child welfare in particular, we focus on, is their body okay, and are they at school? And then they should have well-being, right? But well-being is much more than that. You know, if you have kids, nieces, nephews, when you think about their well-being, you think about a lot of things. This tool helps those youth get at that for themselves, help define that for themselves, and helps the adults in their life to be able to have conversations with them about that as that evolves. So that's the second tool. The third thing is a resource that comes out of our research area at the center, and we have a research brief using Minnesota administrative data that looks at the role of supportive housing in the lives of children involved in child welfare on their educational outcomes. That's available on our website. It's also on the table over there. So if you specifically want to see how supportive housing influences educational attainment for kids in foster care or involved in child welfare, you can use that research that we have available. The last thing is this year the center developed in partnership with counties and the state a realistic job preview. So this is a 30-minute video that gives you the good, the bad, the ugly, the rewarding, all aspects of child welfare in Minnesota. And it's really being used by people as they're hiring so that people understand this is what I'm getting into, and yes, eyes wide open, this is what I want to do. It helps us to reduce turnover and that revolving door of people coming in and out of the profession, which we know isn't good for kids and families. So those are the 4 things I wanted to tell you about. I want to thank you all for attending. We do have an awards lunch today, so if you're attending that, you would already know that, and that's for Sarah, Julia, Helen, and Esther, and that'll be at the bottom of the escalator, so we look forward to seeing you there if you're going to be attending that. And otherwise, thank you very much. Hope you have a nice day.